the Select Board meeting for Monday, June 29th to order.
And I will call the trustees to order for Monday, June 29th.
Thank you. Greg, just to be safe, can we reach out to Vince just to be sure he hasn't forgotten or is to confirm whether or not he's joining us?
Sure, I'll let you guys get started and I will try to touch base with them.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you all for joining us for this special meeting to perform a work session to discuss the draft charter for a potential merger between the village and the town. Before we get into the agenda, I just want to do a quick rundown over what we're going to do this evening. We'd like to try to have a hard stop at 10 o'clock. I know that's ambitious, but we're going to try for it. We of course can go past if we need to, but let's try to set a time limit to be respectful of everybody's time. We're going to discuss and resolve the smaller questions and get through as many of those as possible, and then return to the more sticky questions or the questions that require deeper discussion. Hopefully that'll maybe take us to about 8 o'clock, and then around 8 o'clock we can shift over to some more significant discussion on certain sections. And then when we're done discussing, we'll do a quick wrap up and then work on next steps. Andrew and I will take turns reviewing each section of the charter. So if Andrew's doing section 1, he will handle the conversation with both boards. When we move on to a second section, I will handle conversation with both boards. That way, we're not having both boards talking over each other, and we have one moderator per section. We thought that might be the most efficient way to handle the discussion. And I think our goal today is to work towards consensus on as many items as possible and making sure that our questions have been answered. And as Evan informed us, we do have our attorney waiting with bated breath to see if we need to ask him questions. So we do have that option to phone a friend if we need to. And lastly, for public input on the discussion, as always, we will have public input at the beginning of the meeting for items that are not on the agenda. But then we're going to give the public a couple different opportunities to speak. We'll do a quick one at the beginning before we discuss the charter. Halfway through, when we transition from simpler items to more complicated items, we'll have a spot in the middle there for public comment. And then when we are done discussing, when we're done with the work session itself, and before we move on to other business, we'll do a final brief opportunity for the public to make comment. Does that make sense to everybody, board members? Okay. All right, so are there any agenda additions or changes?
Staff does not have anything to add.
Nope.
Okay. Board members, is there anything from consent or any other additions?
Nope.
Okay, none. So then we can skip item 3 and move on to public to be heard. So this first public to be heard session will be for anyone who has something to speak up about to the boards that is not on the agenda tonight. If you'd like to speak, please indicate by raising your hand on your toolbar or by letting us know in the chat if you'd like to speak. Okay, I see Ken. Go ahead, Ken.
Madam Chair, I'm not sure if I should speak now or not. I want to speak to something that was said at the last Select Board meeting, which was all pretty much about the merger charter anyway. I'm happy to wait. It's up to you.
I appreciate that, Ken. I'll give you a turn in like three minutes as soon as we find out whether anybody else wants to speak on stuff that's not on the agenda.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, I think I see another hand. Forgive me, my Teams is moving very slowly tonight. I see Irene's hand.
Mine will also be about the charter itself. Thanks.
Okay.
Just a general comment.
Okay. Any questions or comments about anything else but the charter? Does, Dawn, I see your hand up. Hold on just a second. Since it's public to be heard, I want to make sure the public has a chance. Okay. I'm not seeing anybody else. So Dawn?
I was wondering if we're going to do a follow-up on the police meeting with the police, and because they didn't have, the public felt they didn't have enough time last Tuesday to address everything that needed to be addressed. And I didn't know if there was any plans for either the select board or the trustees to hold future meetings.
That's a great question. And yes, there will be an agenda item on the July 6th joint meeting for us to debrief from the conversation that we had with Chief Gary and Captain Hogue. And part of that will be next steps. What are we going to do next? When will the public have an opportunity to weigh in? So, okay. Anybody else from the public wanting to speak on something that's not on the agenda? Okay.
You have a comment in the chat section, Elaine?
Oh, I do.
Somebody looking to speak, Lorraine Zaloom.
Oh, yeah, she's already, she commented that Dawn asked the question she was going to ask.
Okay, I missed that part. Sorry.
Okay, thank you, Lorraine. Okay, so now we're going to transition to doing public comment about the charter work session. So we had Ken and then Irene, and if anyone else wants to speak, raise your hand or let us know in the chat. Go ahead, Ken.
Thank you all. Good evening. So I'd like to speak to something that I heard at the June 22nd meeting. This was the select board only meeting. I'll try to quote it as best I can. It would be nice to make the select board stipend a little more commensurate with the effort that board members put in. The amount of work this board does and the amount of hours this board puts in comes out to something like 50 cents per hour, end quote. I would like to point out that the number of hours spent by the board is decided by you, the board. If you are agreeing to extra meetings to the extent that your compensation turns out to be something ridiculous, you might consider the number of meetings that you're agreeing to. No one is forcing you to the schedule that you're keeping. To increase your workload on matters that you initiate and then say we need to be paid more seems conflicted. Second quote, no one is going to want to step up for that, meaning the compensation, if we keep working at the rate we're working, end quote. To say that no one will step up kind of flies in the face of the 10 applicants that were just turned in for the most recent select board vacancy. And you can always reduce the extra meetings. It's not a problem for the board, and it must be somewhat abusive to the staff. Final quote. I'd like to make it somewhat rewarding financially so that folks receive some kind of stipend commensurate with their efforts, end quote. I was wondering, when did serving on the board become about compensation? I always thought it was about service. At least that's what I heard from time and again from all of the select board candidates that were just interviewed. There's obviously a desire to serve and not just for compensation. That's all. Thank you.
I appreciate your comments, Ken, and how attentive you are to all the things I said at the last meeting.
I had to rewind the meeting to get it all right.
Well, I appreciate your being so very attentive. And I will point out that there have been multiple board members over the years who have asked for raises, including Irene Renner many times and Max Levy many times. So there is a concern that all of this work that we're doing on behalf of the community, which we do out of service and which we do because some of it is required because we are the second largest community in Vermont. And even though we have a select board like all the other towns in Vermont do, we actually are a small city and the workload is equivalent to that of a small city. So I would say that stepping up to serve on the select board is a huge commitment to the community and providing some recompense for the board members who are spending time away from their families and other pursuits to do the work of the community is something that deserves a small stipend, a little bit higher than what we're getting now. That is commensurate with cost of living, if that. So thank you for pointing that out. I really appreciate it, but I wouldn't want to make a blanket assumption that all of us are serving for the money, because we certainly aren't. Thank you for letting me editorialize. I believe Irene was next.
Thank you. I would applaud that statement that the select board deserves to get more money. I would correct the record and say that I don't recall Max Levy ever agreeing with that statement.
Well, he asked for a raise at the last budget sessions.
Ah, yes, after I was off the board. I would begin my comments tonight with a question. Wasn't the governance subcommittee supposed to come up with the charter? I mean, they were until February, and I'm not sure what happened. This particular merger draft bears little resemblance to the one I saw in February. It's basically a mess. And only one of the 10 board members appears to have taken the time to compare it to our town charter to see what's been left out and what's been piled on to a document that should be very clear and concise. This verbose draft is far from ready for prime time. What a colossal waste of time and money it is. But even if this draft were in fine shape, the public is not ready for a merger vote because they can only meet virtually. Please let us wait until we're past the constraints of COVID. Also, Essex should put this merger idea on hold until an equal number of people from the village and from outside the village representing only those districts can sit at a table and hash out a plan that contains something for everyone. As a final note, I saw 60 people came to the last select board meeting expecting to have a chance to tell what they wanted to about policing. Maybe what the people are showing up for tells you something. They want the boards to deal with police issues. It's time to set aside this costly, lopsided merger plan and focus on what the people want. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anybody? I see Deb McAdoo.
Hi, everybody. I wasn't going to say anything, but I felt that Irene was speaking for me, and I don't appreciate that because I don't agree with her. So I just want to say that not everyone is in it for the policing. Some of us are in it for equity in all departments in all areas. So thank you for your efforts. Keep them going.
Thank you, Deb. I see a couple trustees' hands up, but first I want to make sure that we have members of the public who are ready to speak. Okay, I think the public, so Raj and then George.
It looks like maybe, excuse me, sorry, Elaine, it looks like maybe Patty is trying to get our attention.
Oh, Patty,
I'm sorry, not everybody can see the video, but I see her waving. Sorry.
Thank you, Raj. I appreciate that. And Patty, my apologies. My internet is a little spotty tonight. You're muted, Patty. Please. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I just, again, want to just say to really be in cahoots with what the people want, what they vote on, what they tell you, what they, you know, at all the meetings since I've been here for 4 years, there seems to be a recurring, you know, stream of not really a lot to ask, but just to be heard and to be acknowledged and to at least say, yes, we're working on it. That would be really helpful in whatever you all decide going forward. It means a lot to me. So some of the stuff Irene said, I do agree with, and I want you guys you deserve some compensation, but I want it to be what the people want. I mean, I know it sounds simple, but that's what I want. Thanks.
Thank you, Patty. Lorraine Zaloom.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi. I would just like to ask if you all would reconsider moving forward with merger and working on the merger, given we have a pandemic going on. And there is so much that is shifting and changing because of it that may impact what we might want to see in a merger plan. And also in terms of prioritizing, and what I'm hearing from the town and the junction even, is to maybe prioritize town representation and policing over a merger for now, and table that until next year when we hopefully have COVID under control. Because I'm thinking even things like meeting as a select board and how you collect minutes over social media. I mean, there's just so many things that are being impacted right now that I don't know how we can necessarily know how best to fold that into a merger plan, or how it might impact how we want to merger best and be more efficient. until we kind of get through this thing. There's so many things on the table right now. So that's all I have to say. And by the way, I do support extra money for select boards too. So I, I think people should be paid what, cost of living. So it's only fair. But thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Lorraine. Is there anyone else from the public? Otherwise, I'm going to turn it over to George or Raj and then George.
Thanks, Elaine. I just wanted to address the comments that Ken made. It comes from an awfully large point of privilege to assume that a great many people have the time and wherewithal to dedicate. I think I'm upwards of 30 hours this week of reading and research, and this month, excuse me. If we expect to get a diverse and well-informed group of people to serve in our community, we really need to start thinking about the impact this kind of work has. And we have an awfully difficult time finding new and interesting people to step forward. And I would suggest, and I've heard from other people recently, that a large barrier is having the free time and wherewithal and frankly money to put this sort of volunteer time in. If we hope to hear from, if we hope to hear from everyone in our community, we have to rethink how we do this. And that would start with looking at, frankly, all committees and all volunteer opportunities to see where stipends may be appropriate. I just wanted to put that out there.
Thanks, Raj. George?
Yeah, I just want to quickly explain, respond to what Irene said in terms of the condition of the charter. The last charter, we had to come to an abrupt stop in terms of the charter development because of the pandemic back in April. And at that point, by far the most complex part of the charter was the transitional portion, which describes the representation model, the taxation models, and so forth. And we understood that that was going to occupy the most time, and that's what we correctly spent the most time on. But we had asked Anne, and again, this was all done transparently. We made this very clear in open sessions multiple times. We had asked Anne to look at the village charter, the town charter, other municipal charters, and put together boilerplate language, and also the merger charter that was nearly approved back in 2007, and put together some boilerplate language for the main body of the charter, not the transition portion of the charter. And so she had assembled all that. And again, let me stress, this was not something that I had a private conversation with Anne about. We all had a conversation. I made this very clear that this is what Anne was going to do. So she had all this information, and then suddenly the pandemic came. We were pretty much done with the transition piece. There were some outstanding pieces. But at that point, and again, I've said this before, I knew that Anne was leaving in May. We wanted to make the best of her, the remainder of her employment. And yet we couldn't have any more meetings. I didn't want to have any more subcommittee meetings. The select board hadn't appointed anyone to any new subcommittee members. So I just said to Anne, please just give it your best shot, putting the boilerplate together, and then get it to us. Do not call me, do not call staff, do not call anyone on the select board, because then the fingers will be pointed that there was behind the scenes bias or something going on. And so Anne, that's what Anne did. And I've explained this before. So yes, the condition of the charter that we see before us now and that we're correcting is different than the transitional portion of the charter we were working with back in March. And one other thing, let me point out that the decision to create a governance subcommittee was a unanimous decision. 10 members, 5 selectmen, 5 trustees made an open session back in 2017, and that the decision to go forward and develop a merger charter was a unanimous decision made by both boards, 10 members, back at the end of 2018. So you're talking about, it's sort of like catch-22. people are saying, well, why are you doing this now? Well, we are trying to, we deliberately took our time and tried to have a lengthy, open, careful, deliberative process so that we could listen to everybody. So now to be chided that we've continued this lengthy process, it's sort of what are we supposed to do? This is how it's supposed to be done. We wanted a deliberative, open opportunity, and I think that's what we've done. If the board decides we don't want to go forward with it in November, that's fine. That's great, but I'm just trying to give some background that this isn't something that someone dreamed up in a back room and someone's been working on secretly. This has all been done in open session, and pretty much every step of the way, these have been unanimous decisions. Thank you.
Thank you, George. So we will move on to the workshop portion of our meeting, and and thank you to Greg Duggan for creating the side-by-side document that puts the trustees' comments next to the select board's comments and next to our attorney's comments. That was a huge help. I can't imagine how much work that was. Thank you very much for doing that, Greg.
You're quite welcome.
And there it is, a thing of beauty. In looking at the comments from both the trustees and the select board, it looks like there's certain sections, like I said earlier, we're going to need to focus on in more depth. And I think those sections are 104, 105, 106, and 301. And they are the sidewalk district, the capital improvement district, the formation of the interim board and the permanent board, and proportionality in districts. So I'm wondering if those sections 104, 105, 106, and 301 are the ones that we put in the parking lot for now and go through all the other ones first. Looking to see if a general sense of agreement that that's a good way to proceed. See a thumbs up from Andrew. Thumbs up from Dawn. Okay. Andy, thumbs up.
Raj says yes.
Raj says yes. I can't see everyone's thumbs, so yeses are helpful.
I apologize. You do not have video tonight.
Yeah,
that sounds like a decent plan. Okay, good. Okay.
Yeah.
So, Andrew, why don't I hand it over to you to talk about begin to go through Greg's comparison document, and we'll skip over those particular sections. You can have section 1, and I'll take section 2, and we'll alternate.
Elaine, and so you're talking about subchapter 1?
Yes.
Great. And just to make sure as we go through this, we're trying to not go through wordsmithing, correct? We're trying to stay at a much higher level.
No wordsmithing, please. That's what we have an attorney for. We're just looking for general consensus and agreement, answering questions, and moving on.
Great. It looks like the first portion here has an answer from our attorney, so it looks like we can move on from that within the preamble.
Well, I guess I would, I'm sorry, Andrew, just, do you want the word unincorporated in there? It's not required, in or out? That's all I'm asking. This is Evan. In or out?
How about out?
Andy, since you were the one who brought up that question, are you satisfied with it being out?
Yes, absolutely. Yep.
Okay. Anybody? Great.
If it turns out that it's your question that's being answered, whoever it is, please don't hesitate to speak up and let us know whether you feel it's been addressed.
Sorry, now my tablet's going slow. So it looks like the next one, we have another answer from our attorney. This kind of seems like wordsmithing.
Yeah.
Okay with it?
He will write it appropriately to make sure that it has all the legalese that addresses what we're trying to get at here.
Mm-hmm. Going into the comment for 102 in the transition period. I believe this one may be one of those larger topics, Elaine, that you were referring to before.
You're right, it does actually go along with the other topics.
So I'll add that to that list.
Yeah.
Okay. So moving on to 103. As I'm doing this again, if this is something that you, trustees, select board members, you needed to or you wanted to comment on, I'm not looking at Microsoft Teams, so I can't see you. I can't see if your hand is raised, so just please speak up. So into 103. Looks like we have answers from our attorney, and then it appears as far as a date, that there's a desire to have it on town meeting day. It appears to be the general consensus.
Andrew, if I may make a comment here. Oh, George, go ahead. You raised your hand.
Yeah, I've seen a bunch of questions about this, and that not just here, but in some of the other texts. And you know, the intention here is to put language in the charter that always has the Australian ballot portion of our voting occur on the same day as the Essex Westford School District Australian ballot. That's what we were trying to achieve here. I just thought I'd try to clear that up.
I think that the select board in general, we would prefer a specific day. Like, I understand what Dan is saying with timing of the legislative approval, but then going forward, annual meeting being on a specific day that is set by the calendar. So it could be Vermont Town Meeting Day, rather than making it dependent on another body in the charter. Andy?
So this particular section only refers to the first annual town meeting. There's another section later that defines when town meeting is in general. And my concern here is that we have no provision in here to account for a failed budget vote, because we don't have a budget to fall back on if it doesn't pass. So my concern here was that we need to have time to either revote or repose another budget before the fiscal year begins. If you wait until middle of April to do that, you don't have time, or it'd be very short, much shorter time than if we do it at the beginning of March. That's my concern. Because again, this is only the first annual meeting in this section.
Okay.
I see Greg jotting that note down. I assume that's for our attorney.
It's partially for me to track what you're saying right now, but it's also for the attorney if we have to go ask.
Well, I think that Andy's question about a provision of if the budget fails, is that necessary? I don't think that's something that the 10 of us can necessarily answer right now. So with that intention about being the first annual meeting, should a merger pass, it seems that Dan answers that question.
I think, Andrew, if I can, the question right here is, do you want to do town meeting day as defined by Vermont for that first organizational meeting, that first town meeting? And then with Dan, we can clarify if we need to have a provision in case of a failed budget.
So with it just being that first one, is everybody okay with town meeting day?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, Dan, Karen.
Yes, Raj.
Yes.
Yes.
Sounds like a whole bunch of yeses. So
Great.
that would bring us to 104, which we're going to go past at this moment. Now we are into,
Yeah, skip to 107.
yep. That one question 107 is answered. Going into 8. Looks like we can go past that one in 108. Now into 109. So this looks like it's determining about whether we want a development review board or a zoning board. Again, with the eye though that this is under that subsection of 1 transitional. So is this only this is only for the transitional period as well?
Andrew, I'm not clear. What are you asking? It's George?
So when I'm getting into 10, what did I say? 109. So with planning and zoning.
Okay. Could you, what is your question?
This is the transitional period. So from that moment in time from when the charter passes, as things slowly come together over whatever that period of time would be, this could also be the time to form the either a DRB, or a development review board, or a zoning board.
Okay.
It looks like there's a portion in here about the select board needing to determine about a DRB or a ZBA. My recollection is that from the trustees, we were in favor of a DRB.
Andrew?
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt. My hand's up. Can you missed 108B about the fire department?
Thank you. Clarify wording. Town of Essex not currently operating the fire department.
Andrew, if I may.
Yeah.
That's just a clarification thing. That we can clean that up working with Dan Richardson, is just to clarify that the town of Essex does not currently operate the Essex Junction Fire Department. I think there's just some confusion in the language, but we will take care of that and make sure it's clear, the current situation.
And what we wanted to be clear is neither department goes away.
Mm-hmm.
They continue. They will just operate under the new entity.
Can I add something to this?
Go right ahead.
The most important thing is to continue, because obviously we know the town of Essex right now doesn't operate the Essex Junction Fire Department, but the new town of Essex is not the same as the old town of Essex, and this charter speaks to the new town of Essex, so there should not be any continue of anything, because it's a new. Do you understand what I'm saying? That should, the whole concept should come out.
Yep.
What Greg is mentioning. Thank you, Don, for bringing that up. So, Select Board, your thoughts on a DRB or a ZBA?
I seem to recall seeing a comment from Dan somewhere that the legislature prefers DRBs. And I also recall that when we did the thoughtful growth and action process, we had determined that we would form, well, at the time, we had determined we would form 2 DRBs and 1 planning commission. I think we have a lot of information in our favor to choose a DRB. I think Andy had his hand up.
Yeah, I recall that we had asked the planning commissions, the 2 entities, to go off and talk about it and come back with a proposal, and we haven't seen that yet. So we're making a decision without that input here. So I don't know, and we aren't in this document, we're not defining the roles and responsibilities of either the Planning Commission or the Development Review Board, and the DRB, and they change, I think, in that scenario. So I'm just concerned that we haven't even thought through this at all.
I do recall, Andy, that we had a hope that sometime this spring or summer, we were going to have a summit with the planning commissions and the select board and the trustees, but COVID came along and we were not able to do it. But we did have plans to have that conversation.
So I also see that George's hand is up as well.
Right.
Is that a holdover?
No, it's not. Elaine is exactly right. We had anticipated, and this, and I share the concerns. One of my major concerns is that I had hoped to have and I think some of us had hoped to have a pretty big conversation about planning and development and so forth, and it didn't happen because of the pandemic. Let me get to the specific issue. The intent initially for having a planning commission and DRB is that the planning commission, in this sense, would become a pure planning body. It would not review applications. When you have this is not just my opinion. This is generally what my research and I think I was the one that said, maybe if Dan said the legislature prefers DRBs, I think I may have said that too. But the understanding here is that the planning commission in this scenario, when there's a DRB, would become a pure planning body. They would only do adjustments to building codes, but then they would also take on the planning functions of your typical of a zoning board in terms of making adjustments to zoning regs. And the DRB becomes the sort of the action commission. They're the ones that review applications, and they would also handle zoning violations and requests for zoning variances. So one entity becomes a pure planning entity. The other entity becomes the sort of interface with the public interpretation entity. That's my understanding of how this works, and that's my understanding of the sort of the modern evolution away from traditional zoning and planning commissions. So I just wanted to give that background. And then I was also the one who added in there with that anything the Planning Commission does in Chittenden County, any changes has to be done in conjunction with the Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission. We don't get to write our own stuff. They have to approve it and say that it's okay. And I'll stop there, but later on I've got more to say about this, but I'll stop there. I just wanted to clarify those 2 points.
So I would say, what are the select board thoughts on this? Does it feel that it is? I mean, I know with the thoughtful growth and action that was mentioned before. Thoughtful growth and action was a multi-month process. I included the planning commission from the town and the village. I believe the chairs of both were the leaders of that. Greg, I know you were instrumental in this. We had a significant public process that had a couple of consultants who had helped to shepherd this through. We had multiple public input opportunities. I remember sitting up against the walls at Maple Street Park in the EJRP building, as there was a few different like charrette style conversations. And what came out of that was a recommendation around one planning commission and 2 DRBs. So this is certainly something that planning commissions have talked about from that process. And then again, there was a subsequent meeting between the 2 planning commissions when we were first going through this process, where the 2 of them had discussed that as well and agreed that that having a planning commission and DRBs would be the way to go. Granted, that has been maybe 3 or 4 years. I would frankly be skeptical if those opinions really had changed. Andy?
Then I guess my question then is, since we will be transitioning from one model to another as soon as this charter is approved, do we need transition language for how planning is going to there's going to be a point in time where we have no planning commission and we're going to have no DRB, right? So do we have to have some sort of transition time, right? It says prior to the effective date of the charter. I'm just reading the language there, the first line of section B there. It's confusing to me how we have power to do anything before the effective date, but I don't know, maybe I just want to make sure we have a transition.
Right. Greg, I see you've had your hand up a little while.
Sure. Just to speak a little bit to the TGIA process. Everything you said is accurate. That's been talked about is accurate. I just want to bring up one clarifying point that when we did TGIA, it was looking at consolidating the planning and zoning as opposed to having a merged community. So it was a little bit of a different scenario of having the two separate communities still in place and how to consolidate. I think the message was still valid. The results were still valid, and yes, as far as the summit for the Planning Commission and the ZBAs, it was unfortunately sidetracked by COVID. I'm happy to try to reach out to the chairs at least in the coming days or week to see if they have any input or feedback that I can bring back to the boards. I can even invite them to the next meeting on this coming Monday, the 6th, July 6th, and see if they want to weigh in that way at all too.
Thanks, Greg. Evan?
Okay, thank you. Couple things. This would be a good topic for Dan Richardson if we are to call him tonight, which it sounds like we are likely. I know that Greg and I have spoken to him. He had some research to do. He may not have gotten it, but at least he could opine. And then also, please don't get hung up too much on this language. He is going to have to rewrite it anyway. And I'm sure he's going to have to not only do a transition period and then also effective after. So we can address that with him when we get him on the phone.
Okay.
But I think it's really just what is a preference if you have one. If not, we'll hold it off till we talk to him.
Is there a preference, Select Board?
I'm leaning towards DRB.
I'm relying on the background information that you guys presented to me, not being part of the Thoughtful Growth in Action group. That I think that if we've done reviews on this before, and from what Dan Richardson's advice was, that DRB is the way to go.
Yeah, I'm okay with DRB as long as we have a transition plan, a way to get there from where we are today, because this makes that change.
I agree with Andy.
Thank you. Sounds like there's consensus.
Right.
The other problem I saw in this section is that it says that a 4-year member should be appointed, but later in section 803, we limit terms to 3 years for planning commissioners. It's just an inconsistency.
So so just making sure that's consistent throughout. Yeah. Yep, I'm just taking a look through the rest of the comments here.
Oh my God.
Looks like there's a question around whether seats should be assigned by ward. Given that this is the transitional period, did we want to go down that path at that point? So the question to the boards, if anybody would like to address that, go ahead, George.
Well, Andrew, I have actually a different question, just a procedural question. We just looked at and asked everybody on the select board if it was okay for a DRB, but you didn't poll any of the trustees. Are we not? What you're gonna? What's the procedure? We're gonna go all the way through this, just asking the select board, and then go with the trustees, or are we
No.
alternating, or what exactly are we doing?
I thought at our meeting for the trustees, I thought we had voiced our opinion or our desire to have there be a DRB.
Okay.
Since you brought it up, we can just make sure that that is correct. Trustees, how do you feel? Would you like the Development Review Board? Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
We can hear you. People keep forgetting that you're not looking, so there are
Roger's
people
good
raising their hands.
And now there's no hand raised.
Andrew, just how about a roll call?
I heard Raj say DRB is a yes. Andrew would say DRB is a yes. George?
Yes, since I put it in there, yes, I would agree with that.
Great. Amber?
Yes.
Dan?
Yes.
Love it. That's how we're doing this from now on, roll calls.
Okay, there we go.
Thank you for that procedural point.
You're welcome. And if you might, I threw this question in there because, obviously merger's an interesting process. And if the village and the town somewhat want to consider how a DRB and or a plan commission is appointed, you could do them at large. You could take applications, do them at large. You can also do them by ward. If you do create two districts, you're creating two districts. Do you want to try 3, and one, and then you've got the 7th, whatever you do with it. But either way, it was my just throw it out there that at least for the transition or future, if that's how you wanted to do it, you could at least start it off that way.
So going through the similar process, I'm happy to have we'll start with trustees around whether having this by award or not. You can do this by roll call, and how about George? We'll start off with you.
Yeah, I would not like it to be by ward. I'm not a big fan of voting wards to begin with. I'm a big fan of talent and interest, and I would like to have the people who want to be on the DRB be on a DRB. And I think it's the best way. I wouldn't want to see it broken down by wards. I think in the transition period, yes, I think the trustees should appoint 3 and the select board should appoint 3 in that interim period, that transitional period. But thereafter, I would just want to see these positions to the greatest extent possible thrown open to the whole community.
So this is just for clarification. Just for clarification, George, so this portion is only pertaining to the transitional period. This is not beyond in a fully merged community. So for the transition period, you're saying yes, you'd be okay with wards?
Yes. Well,
okay.
Yeah, sure. I guess that's a different way of putting it. The wards don't really in until the following, my understanding, the wards wouldn't really be in the interim period, really wouldn't exist until your first full select board election, but maybe it's a hypothetical point. But yeah, anyway, yeah.
Maybe I'm using the wrong word here. I may have used ward instead of district, because I believe that is
well. Right now, I'm saying the trustees. Right now, the trustees on any can appoint and only appoint people to a planning commission or a ZRB who live in the village. The select board can appoint anybody who lives in the village of the town. And I guess, I mean, I don't see a big reason to change that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not really, it doesn't really, I don't want to get into a big argument. I don't think that's
gotcha. We'll go to Dan.
Yeah, I agree with George. Right now, during the transition period, I think just the way it is with the trustees.
Okay. Thank you, Dan.
Whatever you want to call it.
Okay. Amber?
I agree with George.
Raj?
I'll go with George.
looks like we have a consensus here.
Wow. Thank
Why
you.
don't we?
No, no, no. Can I
Why don't
ask
we go?
can I ask behind whose mic is the hammering? It's okay if it needs
Yeah.
to be there, but if there's someone that's not currently talking that can mute their mic, that'd be great.
Thanks for that. So we'll turn to the select board. Elaine?
So, Andy?
Oh, okay. I thought Andrew was running the discussion. So okay. Okay, so I can go. I know that there are people outside the village who have concerns about how development will proceed going forward. Having said that, though, given my employer, I have to recuse myself from having an opinion here. Because I can't talk about how the planning gets established. I can talk about the fact that we have one, that we need a transition plan, but the actual nitty-gritty of how planning is going to work, I need to recuse myself from.
Understood. Pat?
I'm fine with, as George described, the mechanism or the language in this. The mechanisms are perfectly okay with me.
Dawn?
I'm not in favor of wards.
Are you in favor of the select board choosing 3 planning commissioners and the
Yes.
trustees choosing for the
That-
transition period?
That would be fine for transition.
Got it. And I agree with what George laid out. Same thing.
Even more consensus. This is a work of art. So as I'm scrolling through the rest of the comments in this section, I see that one that Andy had mentioned about the consistency. There's a mention about the planning commission, whether something should be done through the planning commission or the ZBA. I assume that that's something that can be figured out later on by the wordsmithers.
Yes.
This next one can't be defined in the charter and to create a accompanying document to explain details of charter in layman's terms. Sounds like a great idea. I don't think that's necessarily something for us right now. Bring us into 110, unification and adoption of ordinances. So it looks like there might be a question about what we need to specify whether in this transition period what to do with conflicting ordinances. I'm going to assume this is a recommendation from the attorney about you could specify that the more or less restrictive ordinance would apply for whenever there are conflicts. We take that up with the question. Trustees, we went first for the DRB. I would say select board if you want to go first on this one.
Thank you. Select board members, your thoughts?
So I hate to be the one who might potentially open a huge can of worms with this, but even selecting something as simple as more or less restrictive seems like it is going to bring up a lot of questions depending on the ordinance. Most notably, the one that we as select board members grappled with last summer, which is in particular firearms. There are vastly different ordinances related to those from the currently in the village versus the town. And if we choose to pick a less restrictive ordinance with that, we are going to get a large outcry and it's going to be a very long conversation. If we pick a more restrictive one, we're going to have the exact same. We're going to have a large outcry and it's going to be a long conversation. I think that works for some things, but I really think that we may need to go through and pick out, there are some ordinances that are different between the two that I think are going to be real problem areas. And I don't think it's as easy as just deciding to pick the less or the more restrictive of the two.
Okay. Andy?
Yeah, I agree exactly with what Pat said. Dog leashing, shooting ordinance. Yeah, there's going to be very, very contentious issues if we suddenly change the ordinances on one or the other. Also, fees are defined in town ordinances. I don't know if they are in the village ordinances or whether there's documented some other way, but suddenly everybody's, somebody's fees are going to change and revenue flows are going to change. And so I think that this section needs a lot of thought.
Dawn?
And we need to figure out how to continue the different districts' ordinances until they can be reconciled.
I agree with both Patrick and Andy.
Is there a middle ground here where we can make a statement in the transition period that says until or when and until the chief of police makes recommendations regarding particular ordinances, that the ordinances in effect in the village are maintained in reference to just the duplicative ones?
That sounds like a Dan Richardson question, because I think it's a really good one. I'm just wondering if, again, at the point where we become one town, is it okay for us to have different ordinances impacting different parts of our population like that? I'm not really sure. So I think that this is absolutely if you forgive me, Evan, maybe a call Dan question. I can just see this getting really expansive really quickly unless we do know for sure that we can keep two sets of ordinances on the books until such time as they can be cleaned up.
And just because I want to be punitive, I would suggest maybe some of you take some time to email me some of the ordinances that pop into your heads that may need some of this versus, that was a good one. The gun discharge, dogs on leashes. If there's, any others that you could think of off the top of your, over the next couple of days, please shoot them to me and Greg so that we can sort of get an enumeration of them.
I think Chief Gary has a list, doesn't he have it? Isn't he already working on this?
I'm talking about any ordinance that may come to mind where you all feel that less restrictive or more restrictive would be an absolute problem that needs to be worked out.
Great.
I'm raising my hand real quick. Sorry, Andrew.
Thank you, Rush.
I don't know if it's okay. I don't know if we're still on the select board or can I?
No, go ahead.
Sounded like everybody went.
I'm just, this is one of those things that would have been nice to get to, barring COVID. If Chief Gary has a great comparison, something incredible like Greg's side-by-side, this was one of those things that, like I said, would have been super helpful to be able to go through and sort of see what sort of scale we're dealing with. I have some in my head. I'm sure everybody has the ones they think about all the time, but I just frankly don't have a sense of how many we're dealing with. And if for no other reason, there's just haven't gotten to it yet, that topic yet. So if anyone has one and is willing to share it, or if any staff or the chief has one, it'd be great to see. And I would hesitate to kind of go one way or the other without knowing, like everybody else has said, what the ramifications are.
Thanks, Raj. George?
Well, I won't hesitate. This is a potential deal breaker, and with all due respect to the police chief, which I certainly respect his wording, but the ordinances that I've been involved with passing in the village, sometimes they are not generated by the police; they're generated by the public. And if we take, if you want to, like for example, a livestock ordinance, and we have other kinds of ordinances that deal with livestock and farming that are restrictive in the village, that would be crazy to have in the town outside the village. And yet I wouldn't want to see those village ordinances change. But certainly something like, as we brought up initially, the gun ordinance, the gun discharge ordinance, you simply can't. It's not even a question in my mind that you can change the discharge ordinance for the village. So I think the question for Dan Richardson is, how do you have a consolidated community, but allow for two very different sets of ordinances within that community? Because Essex Junction is only going to get more densely developed. Okay, it's not going to go in the other direction, and we are going to have more and more people living in a smaller space, and we are going to need to have different ordinances than you have in the town outside the village. So I think this is a huge question, and you're right. It's too bad we didn't get to it. This is one of the issues that, it's regrettable because of the pandemic. But I think this was something that we kind of anticipated was going to need a lot of work. Thanks. I'm done.
Thanks, George. Dan?
Yeah, George kind of summarized a little bit what I'm talking about. There's no cookie cutter way to go about this. You can't just say that everything can carry over because the difference in the density and the setbacks, property lines that aren't really ordinances but in code, and just a lot of differences in the community, the way it's laid out. The more rural area, obviously with the gun shooting and noise ordinances. We created a bunch of ordinances, I think even before you were on the board, Andrew, when we started going through the issues that people were concerned about. But the problem is we can have all the ordinances in the world, but very few are really enforced. It's something there, but we haven't done a lot of enforcement, and then the PD has a tough time keeping up with as it is. So it'll be tough, the transition. I think we're just going to have to continue with what we have in each community, the village and the town, until the transition's done.
Yep. Amber?
I agree with the select board members, and I feel like this is really a parking lot issue that we need to get Dan's opinion on, and so there's probably not much more that I can say about that.
And Amber said it for me. So when I go back through and see the hands raised, I see Raj, you still have your hand up.
Yeah, just one more thing. It'd be nice to know if there was a way from Dan to if there was a way to word this section that during the transition period, the select board would look at individual ordinances with an eye towards preserving the original intent for the original area the ordinance covered. And if there's a way to sort of get through this with that sort of mission or intention laid out in the charter. So, obviously no one in the village is interested in changing a firearms ordinance in the more rural area of the town of Essex. But we certainly are interested in preserving it so if there was something along that line where we said the select board will go through the ordinances in a timely manner during the transition with an eye towards preserving the intent for the original covered entities area. That may get us, I don't know if it's even possible, but it may buy a process and that the select board can then work on, that everybody can say, oh, okay, well, what they came up with does meet that original intent of, just a thought.
Yep. Thank you, Raj. Dan, I see your hand is up.
That was just legacy. Sorry.
Got it. No worries. So it sounds like as the parking lot until we can hear from Dan. So we're good with it. We can move on to 111 with personnel. See that there was a question along with the assumption that all employees would essentially all be under one employer, if I had that right, under fewer associations. Not even sure if this is something that we would be able to change. So I assume we just want to move on from that one. A couple of portions that Dan Richardson says can go into personnel policy, bring us into section 112. So there's a comment here about discussing with the trustees and to get clarification from Dan. Clarification from Dan, I'm assuming, should probably come before we get the discussion with the trustees. Evan, is that correct?
I'm reading it. So
Yes. Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead, Andy.
So I was going to say that the question, because I raised this question, was this specifies in the charter that there'll be two different cost systems, and it limits the ability in the future of a select board to make a different choice. And so I'm just want to make sure that we word this in such a way that we're not limiting future flexibility with regard to how water is priced or costed or whatever. And then, then there's the other piece that, part of our system is in Colchester, right? So,
yeah, so I think, thank you, Andy. So thanks for that clarification. I think what we're saying is the town would have the authority to have different rates for different segments of its system based upon the cost of operation. And in the future, those may actually, and as a goal, move closer to the same rate, but you would have the authority to have separate rates for separate areas of the community based on legacy cost, and then so be it. And then so every year, the board would be approving those rates at its budget meetings. And then by ordinance, like you do now. But thank you, Andy, and we will, Greg, I'm sure you've got that comment. So, and when we get Dan, if we get him tonight, we can run that by him as well. But just so everybody is clear, the town rate and the village rate are relatively far apart based upon their legacy. And staff is not recommending that they be merged at this time to one rate, but over a period of time, we could work towards that goal.
right. And my intent was to make sure we don't put language in here that limits that.
Good catch.
So it sounds like until we get the answers from Dan, we should move on to the next comments, which goes into 115. And it seems like these were questions for Dan and not something for us to answer. And on that note, that is the end of subchapter 1. And Elaine, you are up with subchapter 2.
All right. Thank you, Andrew.
So there were a couple sections that were deleted from the original one that we didn't cover. Do we want to cover those at the end, or do you want to include them?
Sections that were deleted from the charter?
Yeah, stuff that was in our current charter that's no longer in this charter.
Oh, right, the list that you shared with us at the last meeting.
Right. So it's actually way down at the bottom of this document. So I don't know if you wanted to wait until we got to that point, or you want to discuss them now. Because in the ordinance section, there was a clause that said, "and impose penalties for the violation thereof." And that,
if I could jump in on that, I would suggest, do we want to hold off until the end? And the only reason why I say that is with part 1 being the transitional period. If we want to hold off on things that weren't put into the charter, as well as things that we wanted to see. I know the trustees, there were a couple of things that weren't included in this.
Sorry, maybe I'm jumping the gun here, because it's the former 103 section from the old charter. So you're right, it makes sense. It does not make sense to do it now, because I've got the wrong numbers, because it's the old charter sub-chapters. Sorry.
Right. Yep. No worries. Yep. To me, 1 equals 1, but this time it doesn't.
Yeah. But in this case, it doesn't. Yep. Gotcha. Sorry.
So
back to you.
Subchapter 2, just to be clear, is not a transitional section. Am I correct? Subchapter 2 is a permanent.
Correct.
Okay. So looking at subchapter 2, we don't have any comments or questions from board members on section 201 or 202. And section 203, there is a question regarding whether we should keep the language more vague or, excuse me, section 203. Question on whether to keep the language more vague or more specific, and Dan Richardson already advised that we're able to keep that vague. So unless there's further comment, we can move on from that one. 204, there are no additional comments. Before we going back to 203B, Andy, you had a comment. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. I'm jumping. That was related to the vague comment, so never mind. 204, no comments. 205B, question for Dan, and it does not appear to have an answer. Is this necessary given subchapter 3? Did we ever get an answer to that, Evan or Greg?
I'm just reading the notes down below.
Hello.
Voting districts.
I'm on a,
We can double check with Dan on 205B.
Okay. Okay, so that brings us to section 3.
You got off easy.
Yeah, section 301 we opted to save for a more deep discussion. And like me to take up section 3 because section 1 was quite long.
I'm not letting you get off that easy. You gotta keep going.
I'm gonna keep going?
You keep going.
Okay, yeah. So section 301, we opted to have a deeper discussion on that shortly. So we're going to skip over that for now. Section 302 does not appear to have any comments. Section 303, the edit in that section is dependent upon the conversation in section 301. Section 304, there's a number of comments.
Sorry, I had a, so 303E, or have we not gotten there yet? Am I
Hold on,
jumping
I'm not
ahead?
sure. Hold on. No, 303E.
They've been renumbered here, right?
Oh, right,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. It used to say E, now it says C. Sorry, that's
Yeah.
been changed. Yeah, the question here is, it says elected select persons shall represent the town and the ward. And now it says they're elected by. Thank you for changing that. I'm just uncertain whether the representation is for both, and I guess
In our this is Evan, in our conversation with Dan, yes, the answer is both. You're elected from the ward or district, you represent your district, and you represent your community.
Okay.
And the other piece that Dan advised us was that if the person's elected by the ward, but if they move out of that ward, they would have to give up their seat.
Yeah, and do we need to have language in here that says that, or is that in statute?
The impression I got from Dan was that it was in statute, but we can certainly confirm that with him.
Okay.
And just so that you all know, I sent it in through chats. Dan is going to be available at 8:15. So we have about a half an hour to get through all of what we want to try to get through, and then it'll be available.
Well,
And
Evan,
he could be sooner.
Evan, it doesn't seem likely we're going to go move that rapidly. So I wonder if we should just simply, I'm sure that you and Greg are both keeping a list of the things that we said, let's talk to Dan. We talked to him about those.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah, I could, we could see where we are at 8:15 or whatever, and I could also try to push him a little later. He was outside at what appears to be a soccer game or something that, so he'll be available at 8:15 or after.
Okay. Okay, we were just wrapping up section 303. Section 304, vacancy in office. Judging from the lines and the bubbles, it looks like we needed to, no. Remainder of the, so the section where it says EH wants clarification on what this means, actually that's the last line of section 304. Separate filing shall be made for such unexpired term. I'm not sure what that means. I'm assuming it means filing to run for office, but it's not clear to me what that means. Does anyone else have questions or comments on Dawn?
Elaine, on that, it says if more than one vacancy occurs, so then whoever was interested in running, they would each have to file separately for that term that they want.
That's what that means. Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. So it's basically not two people running for the same seat. You have to specifically declare which seat you want. Got it. Okay. That's very helpful. Okay. Section 305. Lots of comments regarding whether this is necessary, the commentary about a tie vote, whether it's necessary depending on an odd or even board. And so that's dependent upon our discussion on section 301.
There's one other comment in there that we don't specify when a select board member's term begins. In our current charter, it begins the first day of the month following the election. And here we have no, it says at the first meeting following the annual meeting that you're going to elect officers, but we don't say when the term actually begins. You got to allow for recounts and so forth. So
we say the first meeting of April after the election.
Right. So what our current charter says, yeah, they start the first day of the month after the annual meeting, and as soon as possible in that month, an organizational meeting is held to elect the officers.
So we should be updating that language to include that specificity. Would you all agree?
I do, yes.
Okay. Trustees, do you agree with that?
Andrew says yes.
Sure.
Sure.
Sure. Okay. All right. Section 305, election of governing body officers. Oh, okay, that was for section 305, not 304. Okay. The tie comment is dependent on section 301's outcome. Redundancy in section C of 305. So section 306, compensation. We heard some commentary about that at the beginning of the meeting. I'm curious about board members' thoughts on this. Select board. Dawn?
Thanks. I don't serve for compensation, so I'm not going to have any say in this. It's up to you.
Okay.
I think the select board member compensation should be set by the budget process. I know there's a minimum in statute of $500, right? That's what's in our current charter, but we get 1,500. I don't know. I'm not in it for the money, but I understand the whole concept of can you afford to have can you have, if you need daycare in the evening, can you pay for it with the money that you're given?
Right.
And that's a very valid concern. If you can't participate because you can't afford to, so.
Right. Do you, Pat or any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, if this was any other time, I would I would absolutely be advocating for, a larger payment or than the select board currently gets, because, we all know what these meetings take and how much time goes into them. But I mean, as it is right now, I don't personally feel that I could vote for anything more than what we currently have on the books. I mean, we're getting $1,500 a year. I would keep it at that and then let future raises be determined by future select boards.
Okay. Trustees, what are your thoughts? This would be a raise for you.
I see that other trustees already have their hands up, so let's go with Amber.
So I read this section as this is setting a minimum. So I don't think we need to decide tonight what should be paid. It's just where should we set that bar? So I actually brought this up when we discussed it with the trustees because I was wondering what the change was. And obviously, yeah, it's a change for us significantly. But so I'm in favor of leaving it with the minimum that's currently in there if we have to put something into the charter. If we don't have to define it at all, then why are we defining it?
Okay.
Raj?
I'll echo what I said earlier. I would make it a minimum of $100 per meeting. Andy used the example of daycare. This is an equity and an inclusion and a diversity issue. It's not about, $100 a meeting. Nobody's still doing it for money, but people do work 3 shifts in this community. Still at a very big employer, for one thing, and we are desperate to get other voices in this. And we are talking about a very, very small portion of this budget, this community's budget. I think if a select board member wants to forego, if they're of the means where they want to forego or donate back a portion of their stipend, that's up to them. But if we're going to get any other voices than the usual suspects and frankly demographic to show up, I think we need to up it and put a minimum that starts to make it possible for people who don't normally show up to show up. So I would advocate for $100 a meeting, which comes out to an average of $2,400 a year, barring any extra meetings or anything else like that, and then leave it up to the remainder of the budget process to see how the rest of that goes.
Thank you, Raj. Dan?
I hear what Raj is saying, and I think, I'm not in it for the money, and really think if we saw a little bit of an increase what we have, I agree with leaving it minimum 500, but $100 a meeting, I would disagree with that. And then are we $100 a meeting, and then if you're on another board, say like the Regional Planning Commission, and you're getting $100 through those meetings as well, it just, I don't know. And then I think the more difficult thing for most people is the times that the meetings are occurring, not so much the financial aspect of it, but the evenings and long meetings going till 10:30, 3. We're looking at a 3.5 hour meeting tonight. It's that's a long time for a lot of people. So, I mean, we'd have to change the structure of the meetings. That's all. All right, that's all.
Thank you, Dan. George?
I kind of agree with Dan. I sympathize. I understand what you're saying, Raj. I appreciate it. But personally, I think starting to $100 a meeting would put us on a slippery slope. I don't think people should be doing this for the money. I know that I've always done it out of love for my community, my desire to revitalize the village center, and the opportunity to sit here and share thoughts with you wonderful folks. So I wouldn't, that's reward enough for me. Thank you. I guess I'd go with the minimum. That's helpful.
I would echo all of what Raj had said. I wholeheartedly agree for all the reasons that he had already stated. I know when I first got onto the trustees going on almost 9 years ago, with a family income slightly beneath the median, frankly, what this allowed for is for us to go out to eat and reinvest that back into the community. So speaking from that perspective, I think it had been helpful, but that certainly was not the motivation as to why I ran in the first place, nor was that the motivation as to why I do this still. So I would support with what Raj was saying. I would also recommend that everybody look at VLCT's annual survey on salary. I found it interesting how many communities in the Northeast Kingdom, in Southwest Vermont, Southeast Vermont, Rutland County, for instance, where their select board, their stipend is $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 a year. So it was kind of shocking. We'll leave it at that, and it looks like there are other hands up from the select board members.
Can I just clarify one thing for trustees to end the conversation, just to, because I don't want a soundbite going out there saying that Raj wants $100 a meeting. That is what I would assume that 2 meetings a month would break down to over the course of a year. We all know that we have been averaging more than 2 meetings. But again, you know, I can say for myself, and I assume some of us, we're not doing it for the money. But for a lot of people, that amount per year is very significant and would be the barrier for, you know, it would be the fee to play. And frankly, that's kind of what we want. I mean, we're not going to get those other voices without putting our very small amount of money where our mouths are. But just, sorry, I just wanted to clarify the monthly thing.
Andy.
Yeah, I just remembered that the Regional Planning Commission has a public participation plan, and in that plan they have a dollar amount that they pay people that are on their committees, their ad hoc committees, to get people that participate so that they can afford to do it. And I just think it would be worthwhile to look at what their, you know, what they're, the last time I saw it was in 2014, and it was $50 a meeting. I don't know if it's more than that now or not, but there's certainly precedence for doing it on a per meeting basis. And I also agree with Raj that if you say you assume you're going to have 24 meetings a year and you set it at 2,400 to cover that, then I would support that.
Dawn?
Go ahead. I didn't.
Okay.
I thought you were just, Andy was commenting on the trustees, that was all.
Oh.
As I said earlier, I don't do it for compensation, so I do it because as George says, I like to serve the community.
I just want to add to my comments. I really appreciate Raj reminding us of how privileged we are to be having this conversation. And a little bit of this conversation has me worried because it's starting to sound like we are making a difference, or we're the implication that those who do it for the love of the community versus those who do it, but they need money to do it. Like somehow you're more deserving of being on our board if you're willing not to get paid for it. And I just want us to be careful, because I'm sure that's not what any of us means, but that's what it's starting to come across as. And Raj is 100% right. There are some people who work a day job and then an evening job. And if they have thoughts about our community too. They care deeply and they want to get involved, but they absolutely can't because there's no money in it. I think the $100 a meeting concept is very interesting. We should pursue it. For the purposes of the charter, I agree with Amber to keep it at the minimum, the way it is. And then we have this conversation, or the new select board has this conversation when it's seated about compensation and making sure that it's worthwhile for every person in our community to consider stepping up. We need to be very careful that we are not making assumptions about everybody who wants to serve but can't. So thank you, Raj. I'm sorry, a consensus then is that should we keep it at the minimum? Select board, are you happy with the language that's in section 306 currently?
There's a comment in there about it being presented at a meeting. Not sure what that means in context of Australian ballot.
Well, you know, currently it's a line item on our budget that it's presented at town meeting. And, you know, now we're voting on the floor, but in the future, we could conceivably be voting Australian ballot, but we are
okay,
presenting
yeah.
it.
I guess I'm just asking a wordsmithing question. I withdraw my question.
Okay. I see George has his hand up.
I'm sorry, but I'm going to push back a little bit here, because there's also an implication that if we do it out of love of the community and volunteerism, that somehow that implies we're privileged, and I don't think that's necessarily true. I hope that's not what you're saying. Some people who may not, there could very well be lots of people who could very much use the money, but they don't do it because they do it out of love of the community. And the fact that people are on here and they're not looking for more money doesn't mean that we're privileged. And I don't assume that's what you're saying, but I just want to push back a little bit on that. Thanks.
And I appreciate that. That's not what I was saying,
Okay.
but I was afraid we were getting into territory where we were starting to make that distinction. Okay. Consensus that we're keeping it at the minimum that's in section 306. I saw Dawn shake her head yes. Andy and Pat?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
Yep.
I see Andrew's thumb up. I thought I heard Raj, thought I heard George.
No.
Raj,
Yes.
Raj is a no on that. Okay.
Just for clarification from my perspective, you mean the 500 that's in there now, not the edited. Is that right, Elaine?
Oh,
I'm sorry.
I didn't realize that was two colors in my document. I was thinking 1,500 because that's what the select board gets. I think because it's going to be a select board in the future, that the current select board salary should be what's for the future select board to start with. Is that a safe assumption?
I think so. Yes.
So 1,500.
Yes.
Okay. Any additional comments on 306?
Can I ask for clarification? Do the trustees want it at the $500 minimum or the 1,500?
We'll do that roll call. Andrew would say 1,500. George?
I'd say 1,500 since that's the consensus so far.
Dan?
I'll go with the consensus of 1,500, but I'm fine with keeping it 500, but higher, it's fine.
Amber?
I wanted it at 500, which is what it currently is.
Raj?
2,400.
So if we average out the differences, it sounds like 1,500 might be okay.
Again, it's a minimum, and it can be set by the future select board. Okay, 307.
Sorry, but 306B and 312 are redundant. Is that just a wordsmithing? Should I not bring those up?
Greg, have you brought that up with Dan?
I don't think we got into the redundancy stuff, but we can once we take a better look at it. He can let us know comments and deal with it.
Yeah. Okay.
307, we had some questions. Greg or Evan, do you want to talk about Dan's responses to our questions on holding other office and the ability for whether or not the select board should have the ability to discuss personnel in the way it's mentioned in this draft?
We did discuss, I'll turn my camera on. We did discuss the select board talking about employees. It was brief. It is generally not a very good idea for trustees to talk about employees in open session. If there is a need for a discussion of employees or employment conditions, they should do it in executive session.
And any clarity on holding other office?
I think that's going to need to be wordsmith. I think holding other office has a different meanings. You could be a state rep. You could be on the CCRPC. So I think that needs his clarification.
So
One of the things I could tell you is, and I cannot remember, I think it's the town does not allow a town employee to be a select board member. But the village does not have that language. I would recommend that employees of the new entity not be allowed to be select board members. To my mind, that's a conflict.
Okay.
You may want to have that discussion. And then you could also ask Dan his thoughts.
Board members, any thoughts or comments on section 307 before we get some feedback from Dan?
And if I could, I'm going to add one of the things is in very small towns, it is common for an elected official maybe to be the road commissioner or the public works director or something like that. In a larger community, it is different.
Yeah, I think I was the one who had the question on this, and I think in instances where there's obvious oversight of one from to the other, then it makes sense. But the specificity I was looking for was, to school board, other boards, an elected office, what have you, and just the language doesn't seem clear here to me. That's what I wanted to get Dan's opinion on.
Okay. All right. 308, no comments. 309, special meetings. Dan has weighed in to say that it sounds like all special meetings should be done by ballot because we'll be moving to Australian ballot in general.
But we had a special meeting like last week.
So I think there's a difference between special meetings of the board versus special meetings of the community for the purpose of voting.
Then this should say special town meeting as the headline so that it's not, because select board has special meetings also, and we make all kinds of decisions in those meetings.
This is a special meeting. Yeah. Greg?
I was going to say with the same thing that you did, Elaine, and it says it in the actual text here, the special town meeting, and Andy makes a good point. We'll just change the header to be special town meetings.
Thanks. Any other questions, comments on that section? Okay. Moving on to section 310. So this generated a bit of commentary and questions. Evan or Greg, do you want to just review what Dan provided in terms of guidance on this?
Dan basically advised that the quorum is the quorum for the full board, not the number of people who are there that night. So if it's a 7-member board, you need 4 members for a quorum and 4 members for an affirmative vote.
Got it. Okay. George?
Yeah, I just want to comment that the idea of the chair of the planning commission voting to cast a tie vote, to break a tie, that was Ann's idea, and that she really put that in, I know, as a placeholder until we made a firm decision about this. I think she just threw that in there. I don't think it's even reasonable. I mean, you ask Dan Richardson, but I don't think you can have an unelected official casting a tie vote on, being the equivalent of an elected official, making a vote on a budget or something like that. So I just want to clarify the background of where this came from. We needed something, if we were going to stick with the 3-3 board, to try to make it more appealing or palatable to the legislature, putting some mechanism in there, and this was Ann's idea. Thanks.
Thanks for that background. I was wondering where that came from.
Where that came from.
In one of the sections that we'll go back and discuss later, like another way to talk about this is that the chair does not vote except in the event of a tie. Is another way that can be addressed.
Yep.
So, okay, so section 310, any other observations? Looks like we've got that under control.
310D adds deliberative session. How's that different from executive session?
I could explain that.
We haven't previously had that in language for the town.
I can explain that. It's probably not necessary here, but select boards, village boards are allowed to go into what is known as deliberative session. It is taking testimony. In state statutes, there are some places where you are actually a deliberative body. And so instead of executive session, you are going into deliberative session. And therefore, you also write a report as to what occurred in deliberative session and what outcome. The village board is familiar with this. They've gone through it with the finding of necessity for the Crescent Connector Road. But it's in state statute, so it may not need to be here.
Is there a consensus whether folks want that phrase removed or left in there?
Doesn't matter. Just was wondering what the difference was and why we added it. But
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. Appointments. Andy had a concern that this section might inadvertently cause the select board to lose power. Andy, would you like to review?
Yeah, this section was copied from section 206 of our current charter, and in our current charter there was a list that was included specific appointments. And it's dropped here. I just don't want to make sure we don't lose any specific appointments that we had, that aren't covered in statute or whatever.
So that's something we can ask Dan to make sure is carried over.
Yeah. Okay.
And section 312 is a simple language redundancy. So it is 8:15. Evan, you informed us that Dan Richardson is available at this time.
Well, I could also see if he, again, we can go over what we have to do now and then call him back when we have more. He just said that he would be home by this time. So, but I really do, I'd like to, maybe grab him for the first set of questions and then see what his time frame is to call him back.
Would you like us to give him some more time and move on to maybe subchapters 4 and 5, which are very short, and then try him?
Yeah, so then that'd be great. I'm gonna call him and push him back so that we can get done with 400 and 500.
Okay. Andrew, would you like to take over?
Sure. And Evan, before you call him, maybe if you could ask him if he would prefer to wait until later on tonight until we have all of our questions, as compared to having just a couple of phone calls.
What time might that be? And I know you can't answer that, so that's why I have the
crystal ball says 9.
Well, it's not looking like we're going to have. It's going to take us longer to get through the smaller items than we expected, and we're probably not going to have all of the substantive conversations about those sections we held out tonight. So perhaps if we set a time to call Dan at 9:30 with everything, would that be a decent breaking point? And we'll pick up with the rest of it the next time we meet.
Pretty late.
I guess I would rather, if you don't mind, I'd rather have him somewhere in the 8:45, 9 o'clock, and if we need him for an hour, we need him for an hour.
That's fine. Looks like Dan and Raj have comments.
I apologize. That was a mistake.
No, I just, I agree with, you know, the idea that we might as well consolidate all the questions so he doesn't have to get, you know, repeat calls over the night. But then again, we don't know when we're going to end and how long is it going to take him. Obviously, he's not going to just get these questions and immediately come up with answers. So this could be drawn out, just having him go over all these questions and then, you know, think to himself, well, this is how this should happen. You know, I don't think it's going to come so quickly out of this, you know, back from him. I think it's going to take some time. That's all I'm saying. Not do it right off, I think.
George?
Yeah, I kind of agree. Are there some questions that are burning questions that we need to get answered, or we should try to get answered tonight, versus questions that Dan is going to need to could get back to us in writing. And I hate to make you go through the list, but you know, are there any major stumbling blocks that are preventing us from getting to the end of this piece of work and deciding? I think it's the really critical question of, are we going to put this on the ballot in November? Or, I mean, if we're not going to put this on the ballot in November, then we've got lots and lots of time to have Dan answer these questions. So I guess I would try to frame it that way.
So the ordinance one is a big one.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty big one.
So then maybe I could make a suggestion. Why don't we ask him the ordinance question?
Yes.
And we could ask him that right now. And then ask him his availability for the rest of the night.
I like that idea.
George, thumbs up on that.
And I'm going to ask my esteemed colleague, Greg. Hey, Greg.
Yep.
What do you think about sending him the Teams link?
Yeah.
So that he actually comes in on camera.
Yep, I'll do that.
Good idea.
Okay, I'm gonna call him and let him know.
So while that's happening, shall we continue to move forward with the other subsections? So that would go to subchapter 4 with the Brownell Library and whether this section is required. That seems like something that Dan may need to address. I don't think that's a burning issue right now. And subchapter 4 is done. Go to Elaine.
Back to you, Elaine.
I'm kidding. Do you want me to keep going?
Yeah, keep going.
All right. Chapter 5 with town meetings. This seemed like there was a question about whether we wanted to codify in mailing of ballots. I don't think this was something that the trustees were unanimous on. Select Board, it seems like you may not have discussed this yet.
No, we didn't go over it during our session, not specifically the mailing of ballots, at least.
I'm assuming that this might be, I'm going to assume this is a meatier topic, and we might want to discuss this later.
Yeah, I'd say it's a pretty safe bet.
Just jotting that down.
Endurance level.
Okay, so now going into Andy, you had a question about being too ambiguous and more specifics, and then the response from Dan.
Right, yeah, there's no specificity at all about what date.
Mm-hmm.
The other section referred to only the first meeting, and this is the, in general, what date, when are we gonna have annual meeting?
So my assumption is this would be the point in time of well, and some of this is also then about Australian ballot versus on the floor. I would assume, based on the previous conversations with the transition time and the desire to have it on town meeting day, that if defining one, it sounded like that may have been the desire of the select board.
Yes.
Trustees, would you agree to that? Andrew will say yes. How about Dan?
Yes.
George?
Yes.
Raj?
Yes.
Amber? Amber?
Sorry, I said yes.
Okay.
I thought we lost Amber.
And Evan has a hand up.
It's not that late yet, Raj.
Just a quick Dan Richardson update. He was still in the car. So he said he would be ready in a few minutes. We're going to send him the Teams link, and he is available to answer the burning question. And later on, depending upon what time you all pick, he will be available for other questions later.
Thank you.
So
Dan, good job.
maybe we could certainly finish section 5.
Okay. Dan, I see that you have your hand up.
Or at least 501.
And it's down. So that would bring us to, so it sounded like with 501 that the town meeting day was fine. Going on to part C of that. Looks like there was a question for Dan about the times. Usually set by the town clerk. Yep, so it sounds like changing that to be set by the town clerk and board of civil authority. Everybody is okay with that. That would bring us into subchapter 6. This was one of those of the first one about adding something new that's not already in there. I think I had said to Andy that we should probably put that on hold until we get through done the rest of the charter. I would think that would apply to that first comment as well.
Am I correct in assuming, Evan, that the select board of the new town would be also the Board of Liquor Control, just as it is now? And so therefore, some of the powers that are mentioned in this comment, at least for alcohol, applies or not?
I am going to say yes, you are the Board of Liquor Control, and all the other powers in state statute bestowed upon select boards. But I would also reserve that question for Dan, just to be sure.
Okay.
But you would act as you would definitely act as the Board of Liquor Control.
Can I just say something about this since it was my comment?
Go ahead. Raj, you muted yourself?
Oh, good Lord. The select board didn't see the VLCT, I don't believe, and CCRPC joint report on this topic that I brought to the trustee meeting. So I'd be happy to provide that again. The idea here from my point of view, was to get ahead of some things. Specifically in the village, we had some instances a while ago where we had some vape shops and other establishments open up, and we found ourselves lacking in our ability, if I remember correctly, lacking in our ability to kind of figure out where we wanted these to be located or not. And this is not intended to create an ordinance. This is intended solely to reserve for the community the opportunity to have the conversation for itself. And again, I would encourage, it's actually not that dry reading. I would encourage perusal of certain sections of that joint report that describe how communities can go through that process and the benefits or not of doing that. So it feels, reading the draft document we have, a little out of place because we're not getting this specific, but I do believe that we may want to consider it, probably not tonight, it doesn't sound like, which will then give folks, if they're interested, an opportunity to check that out. Again, it's just to give us the community, the opportunity to have the conversation and decide for itself how it wants to move forward, not to definitely create any sort of ordinance. It's still a process.
George?
Yeah, Raj, I was going to specifically ask you what the St. Johnsbury issue privilege was in terms of doing this. I know I was on the board when we had Up in Smoke and we tried to regulate it, and what I learned and what we learned was the state is very, very selfish when it comes to regulating tobacco products. They don't farm it out to anybody. And neither the trustees nor the select board had much say or control over the issue. So I'd be very much in favor if we could. It'd be great. And I'd like to hear more about it. And if we could put it in the charter, that'd be terrific. But yeah,
I would be happy to.
Would support. I think it might be a tough hill to climb.
Well, I think I would really, again, I'll make sure that folks circulate that report, and maybe I will even highlight certain sections to make it quick for you. But the purpose of that report, it goes to that specific question and lays it out quite simply and plainly. And I have a draft for us adapted from the St. Johnsbury example. They get into livestock and wood and coal. I mean, our charter is not like many others. We don't get into that specificity, our current ones or our proposed one. But and there may be other examples of this where we want to spell out. And again, that report dives into some other areas too. It also discusses where something also I'm very interested in from a public health perspective, advertising on storefront and point of sale and what you can and can't do, which is much more restrictive on what a municipality can do due to other constitutional issues. But if we reserve this for ourselves in our charter, and there are examples of it throughout the state, we have much more ability than we had at the time George describes. And that's the difference.
Thank you, Raj. Evan, I see you have your hand up.
Sorry, no, that's from earlier.
Gotcha. So if we're okay, we'll move past that one just so that we all have time to take a look at that report. I would bring it to 6:02 and a comment from staff about a desire to have the process aligned with what the village does, and that Dan Richardson recommends the same. Do you want to give a brief update as to what that difference is?
Is that what's in the charter now?
No, I believe what's in there now is what the select board has, and this is something that's come up, having gone through a ordinance adoption process with the select board and the trustees in the past year. The select board, as you all know, as the select board members know, have a process where the ordinance needs to be accepted at a meeting and read in, then you have to warn a public hearing, and then maybe another public hearing, and it goes on and on and on until it's adopted. And depending on the issue, it might be quick and easy and nobody says boo, or like the firearms issue, it might drag on for months. The trustees have basically deferred a state statute, or yes, a state statute, which essentially says the trustees adopt an ordinance at a meeting, they post it, and there's a 60-day period where somebody can petition to have it changed or overturned. And after that happens, the ordinance takes place, as long as there's no petition to stop it. Granted, the trustees were dealing with 3 parking spaces on a street, I think, as far as the ordinance goes, so not quite the same level of what the select board was dealing with topic-wise, but it just seemed like an easier process going through it. It's what the state statute calls for, so you'd be sticking with the state guidelines there. Staff just thinks it'd be easier to go with what the trustees have in place.
Okay.
Do we want to get a consensus from the select board around thoughts?
Select board, any thoughts?
Yeah, I guess having gone through the shooting ordinance one, we did get a lot of redundant comments in the couple of hearings we had, but then there were also people that maybe attended one that didn't attend the other. Simpler is probably better, but it's, I don't know. I have to think about whether we're losing something doing it that way.
Dawn or Pat? Good to go, it sounds like.
I'm just rereading it now. Yeah, I don't see any issue with doing it the way that the trustees do it. It seems like it's pretty straightforward as far as, if it is a relatively non-straightforward issue, the options are still there for our citizens to explore and to object to it if they wish. So as long as that mechanism is within there, then I'm happy.
I agree with Patrick.
Okay, there you go, Andrew.
So the old charter had specific language in it, or has, I shouldn't say had, it's still in, our current charter has language in there that's very explicit about the petition process to change or overturn a ordinance, and it's been removed from this charter. Oh, there you go. So it's been, okay, it's been buried in that little section there. It's not as explicit. Or was
Andy,
I blind?
I
Or was I blind when I read it before?
I haven't compared it word for word with the current ordinance, but I'm pretty sure it's the same.
Okay.
The current town ordinance, excuse me.
All right. You just got buried in another section. I'm sorry. I'll take another look at it. Thanks, Greg.
Sounds like we're ready to go on to the next section. The 605 public nuisances. It looks like both boards had some questions on this with a response from Dan saying that it is okay to remove. Seems like it's already within state statutes. So then that would bring us into subchapter 7 and the town manager. Elaine, do you want to take this or do you want me to keep going?
Sure, I can pick up from there. So section 701, the question was from me and Dan definitely answered it. No questions there. Powers of the manager. I appreciated Dan's clarification that these powers should be in there in the event that we don't have there's no contract. So that makes sense to me. Any other thoughts or questions? on 702 before we get to the next page? Looks like we're okay. Next page, Andy, you had a question about the manager appointing the town attorney.
Right. Currently, the select board appoints the town attorney. So this is a change of power or ownership of that.
And
I understand the village, the manager does appoint the village attorney. So just as a change, is this something we want to do?
Mm-hmm. Is it I guess I'm making an assumption because it's not spelled out that the manager is making appointments and can be done which can be done with upon consultation with the board, but that's not spelled out. George had his hand up and then Evan.
Yeah, I was trying to, I've got 3 different PCs going. I'm getting this one and I'm trying to look at the village charter as well. I was trying to look at the precise language. I thought it was, it was sort of like with the advice and consent of the trustees, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that's just bad memory here. Do you know, Evan, is it?
No.
It wasn't quite as explicit as this, I think. Maybe I'm wrong.
I would if you guys want, I would rather the village manager shall make a recommendation and with the advice and consent of the board.
There you go.
Second, there should be a provision in there that the manager can, from time to time, hire legal counsel for special special work.
Yep.
Which does not necessarily need board approval, but from time to time should have the authority to hire attorneys for specialized work. And I believe Dan Richardson has joined us.
I am on the call.
All right, Dan.
Before we turn it over to Dan, just real quick, I want to answer that question about, so in the village charter, what it actually says is that the trustees' approval shall be required for the manager's annual appointments. So the manager does make appointments. We just have to approve. We have the right to approve or not approve of them.
Right.
And that includes the attorney, the clerk, fire chief, tax collector, so on and so forth.
Yeah, that's it. Thanks, Andrew.
Amber had her hand up, and then maybe after that we can switch over to Dan.
Sorry, Elaine, Andrew actually did exactly what I was going to do.
Oh, great.
Thanks.
Sorry. It's okay.
It's all good.
All right, why don't we pause section 702 and welcome Dan Richardson to our audience. Thank you for being here this evening, Dan.
My pleasure. So what can and I apologize, I just opened the Microsoft Teams, and is there something, Evan had indicated there was a question that the boards had for me. If that could be queued up, I'd be happy to take a cut at it.
We did have a question regarding the transitional phase of the charter about ordinances. And how do we go about reconciling ordinances in the village or the town that may be duplicative? And currently there's language in the charter that says we can choose either the more restrictive or the less restrictive ordinance to prevail. However, there are very specific ordinances in both communities that are specific to those communities. And for example, the firearms discharge ordinance and the dog leashing ordinance. So we were wondering if it was possible to allow the ordinances present in each community at the start of the transition to remain in effect until such time as they are individually dealt with, so that the select board of the new community can make a determination which ordinance applies.
You could do that, you know, with the idea that you would apply them for each. What I'd probably recommend is, and I had suggested this to Evan, is, and it sounds like there are a few that differ from town outside of the village and the village itself. There's a couple of different ways that you could approach this. One way would be, as you proposed, where we would essentially have a provision to say that all existing ordinances shall apply to their pre-merger jurisdiction. And we could wordsmith that. So essentially, if there's a dog leashing ordinance, say, in the village that's more strict than outside the town, that could continue. The other way to go about that is to identify the ordinances that have some conflict or difference in advance, and just simply, you know, have those apply to identify those and have those, you know, be one of your first orders of business would be to straighten out those particular ordinances, such as the dog or the firearms discharge, and just simply deal with it within. That would be one of the first orders of business for a transactional board. Another is the language here, where it would be the less restrictive or the more restrictive. So those are different options. I think they would all be upheld. Obviously, the main issue is to make sure that they're clear in their language as to where they apply, so that the average person who would read the ordinance would understand, oh, I cannot discharge a firearm in this spot because of this regulation, as opposed to any type of ambiguity.
Okay, so it sounds like there's 3 different choices, and I'm guessing we are not going to be putting a mix of all 3. We need to choose one.
Right, and you know, I think they're really in some ways the same thing. It's just a difference of timing, which is, you know, it really, if there's only 2 or 3 of these ordinances, I would say deal with them right away, because, you know, something, say, like a firearms discharge, it's not as if it's going to go away, but what you want to do is you want to merge your firearms discharge ordinance into one single one, where you might have different districts where firearm discharge can occur here but not here. And you'd want something that would go together, and you could certainly deal with that right off the bat, and anticipate that that's simply what was going to be happening, and you could lay the groundwork for that in advance, so that the new board just simply adopted these merged ordinances. And then, you know, if it's 2 or 3, that's fairly easy to get off your plate. If there are more, or if you think that your ordinances, because I should say I haven't gone through the town and village ordinances to do a compare, but, you know, if you think there's a dozen of these, or there's so many that it's something you should be taking on sort of one piece at a time over time, then that might be a reason to have this sort of transitional period where the ordinances apply as written to the pre-existing districts, as if the districts still existed. And then have a sort of ordinance merger committee that would look to create that, you know, merged ordinance. But honestly, I think if you look, you'll probably find that there are only a handful of those conflicting ordinances, just simply because I can imagine that there's more than anything else, there's probably ordinances that apply in the village that do not apply in the town. And I would suspect that it might be less regulated, in which case you would still have that sort of special district. You know, idea that this new ordinance would only apply in this particular area, but that would be the ordinance going forward. It's not a transitional ordinance, in other words.
That makes sense to me. Select board, trustees?
I don't want to be redundant. I just want to try to get a sense of what you're saying. So in other words, because I would anticipate, Dan, just to editorialize a little bit, that the density of the village is only increasing, and it's increasing rapidly. And we are going to need, you know, just, I mean, basic things just like parking. I mean, we're clearly, you know, we do now have some differences, and I don't think those differences are going to go away at least, you know, for the next few decades. And so you're saying we would essentially have the former village become a district. So we would, if we're going to say the village is a voting district or a voting ward, we would also say it could also have ordinances that are specific to that ward. Is that what you're saying, or maybe I'm not quite grasping?
Yes, that's essentially it, which would be ordinances that would apply in this particular area. You know, think of it like, I think parking is a really good example. You only have metered parking in certain areas, and you have the power by the enabling statutes and to regulate parking such that you would meter parking in some areas, have paid parking in others, and free parking elsewhere. That's certainly your power. And if you had like a firearms discharge ordinance, you could say that, you know, firearms could not be discharged within the boundaries of the old village of Essex Junction, which, and you'd give some description so that somebody reading it would understand what they would not be able to do. Or you might even have a series of ordinances that, you know, apply in this area because of the density, and you have the justification for it. What I understood the question, and just to be clear, is the difference is there's a difference between those ordinances that apply in one particular area versus two other examples. One would be ordinances that you might want to apply more broadly. So say you had a no burn ordinance that you wanted to apply generally throughout the town and village, that the town doesn't necessarily have, but you would expand it. That's different than an ordinance that, like a firearm discharge, that might only make sense inside the village. The other example is something where there's an ordinance on the books in the village and there's an ordinance on the books in the town, and the two are not quite compatible. And that's really about resolving those differences to make sure that you don't have inconsistent ordinances.
Okay, gotcha.
Andy? Andy, do you have your hand up?
I do, but I also have my mute button on. I was speaking to my armpit. So to be clear, we can't change a ordinance by the charter process, right? We still have to go through the normal ordinance change process to make any changes. Am I still understand that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah, the ordinance process is separate.
Okay.
But in the charter, you might have language that tells you how, for example, you're going to deal with ordinances that you basically, you know, it's going to have language to say that the ordinances that existed before the merger in the town and village are imported into this new entity, so that you're not starting out from scratch. You know, it might wholesale adopt any existing ordinances. And then you might have this additional provision to deal with ordinance provisions that might be at odds. And either you have this type of provision or you resolve it in advance, I think are your options that I'm laying out.
Yep. Okay. Thank you.
Raj.
Thanks. Sorry, I did that a couple times as I had questions answered, and then so in terms of ordinances that may conflict, simply based on the fact that one was in the TOV and one is in the village area, you're saying that those have to resolve. They can't just be not simply, but they couldn't be rewritten in a way that delineates geographic areas. In other words, if I just want to clarify that for myself, I'm assuming that's not how I'm not hearing it right, but.
Right. Yeah. No, that is not what I'm suggesting. I apologize if I didn't articulate that clearly. If you have an ordinance for the town outside the village that conflicts with the ordinance with the town inside the village, you can still have those two provisions, and I'll use the firearm discharge. Town outside the village, firearm discharge may be perfectly fine, and there's no regulation on it. It's just that you have to make it clear where the ordinances apply if you are to keep those two different ordinances.
So it does sound like we'd have to go through a bit of a process during the transition to recodify these ordinances and bring them together in a way that, because they'll be imported, not delineated in the charter. So there sounds like there will have to be some kind of ongoing effort over a period of time. And if that's the case, how does that have to be delineated in the charter? And maybe I missed it. Maybe it's already there.
Well, so there's a couple of different ways in which you can cut at this. First of all, you would have a provision that would import the ordinances from the town from the town as well as the village, so that they're put on the table. What I'm suggesting is that you look in advance at the ordinances to see if there are any clear conflicts. And one of the ways in which you can, if there are clear conflicting ordinances or ordinances that just aren't quite matching, depending on the number of them, one way to go about that is to have a transitional provision where much along the lines that Elaine suggested in the beginning, which is the ordinances would apply to their former geographic boundaries in the new ordinance system. Or, if it's a more limited number, it would be something that you could, the new governing board or the transitional board could essentially adopt an ordinance. That aside, those are really just different ways to cut at transition. In the transition, what I'm suggesting is that at the end of the day, you're going to want, as a new unified entity, a single body of ordinances. And so, for example, if the town outside of the village has an ordinance on firearm discharge, and the village has one, you're going to want those to be together into something. And it doesn't mean that either place has to change, but you just want an ordinance, a single ordinance that encompasses that issue, as opposed to two sets of ordinances going forward. So, in lots of towns where they have a density center may have different ordinance provisions for that density center as opposed to the more rural sections. And in those cases, you want, you just want one ordinance, but it would then delineate. If you're here in the village center and you cannot discharge a firearm because of the population density, whereas outside there's a different restriction or no restriction on the discharge of a firearm, and the ordinance lays it out clearly so that if somebody looks at it, they can act accordingly but they only have one ordinance to look to. And that's what you're aiming towards, is one ordinance system as opposed to competing ones. But how you get there, I think, is something where you can take, you can do it in a couple of different ways, and there's not really one right answer. It's just at every step of the way, there should be a certain amount of clarity for any citizen. Otherwise, it's not enforceable. You have a notice issue, so that anyone should understand, oh, they've adopted the old ordinances and they only apply to the old political distinction between the village and the town, and then or some other provision that would make that distinction.
Thanks.
Sure.
Andy, did you have your hand up again?
Oh, no, that's legacy. Sorry.
Okay. That's all right.
Elaine, this is Evan. Do you want to go back to the top and start down the list from section 100? Or do you have other specific ones you want to address first?
I just recall the ordinance question being the most pressing. I see Andrew nodding his head. Yeah.
I recall that the ordinance one was really the only pressing thing, and that the others we could get through email, as they were largely things like redundancies, those types of questions.
Right. But I think the conversation still remains that, based on Dan is what guidance Dan has provided, what do the boards wish to do?
Maybe at this point, are we good to let Dan go back to enjoying his evening, and other questions we can email him for another time?
Select board, would that work for you?
Oh, there was that one question about DRB. Do you want to ask Dan anything about Plan Commission, DRB, transition? That's one note I have.
I'm just going back up to see what that was.
Yeah, so the question is, we've got a ZBA now, but then the proposal is to go to a DRB. And as soon as the charter is approved, we transition from a planning commission zoning board model to a planning commission DRB model. Just asking, we don't have any transition language to get from one to the other.
You can certainly put that language in, and it would really be a matter of timing. What would happen is everyone on the ZBA and Planning Commission currently, their terms would effectively end. There'd be a period in which the applications for the new Planning Commission and new DRB would be heard by the governing board, and appointments would be made in a staggered manner. So someone might be appointed for 1 year, another person for 2 years, another person for 3 years, depending on the number of appointments that you would make. A DRB can be, I believe, anywhere from 5 to 7 members, and so you would have staggered terms so that you would appoint a brand new board. And cities and towns have done that when they've gone from a ZBA model to a DRB. It's not you wouldn't need particularly complex language. You would just really need authorizing language, and then it would be a matter of business for the new or transitional board to accomplish, and take applications from people interested in participating on said boards, and then making at a public meeting the appointments.
Okay, good. So that's a lot simpler than I thought it might be.
George?
Yeah, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't take advantage of Dan's presence to ask him a question. And I know this is controversial and we haven't dealt with it, but I think it would be stupid not to. Dan, the even numbered board versus odd numbered board, we recently had a decision pertaining to Essex There was a charter change proposal that went down. It had a bunch of issues with it that the Government Ops Committee pointed out. But one of them was that basically, as I interpreted, they were saying an even numbered board is unprecedented. It's not something they like to do. My interpretation, or some of us interpreted that as saying, sending a proposal down there with an even numbered board just isn't going to fly. But some of us disagree with that, and I'd like to get and I put you on the spot.
Sure.
What's your impression?
Well, I read the letter from Government Ops, and I would agree that what Government Ops said is that that type of even board is disfavored. And I tried to think about it between reading that letter and now, and I've asked a number of people, and I have not come across a board, a government board that has been in even number. There's always a tiebreaker in that board, and that's what an odd number does. It's also a little bit of a quirk for a quorum, and so odd number boards are favored just because they do allow a decision to be made even in a split board situation. You get 4-3, you get 3-2, but decisions are made one way or the other. If you have an even numbered board, I wouldn't say that the legislature, that it would be completely dead on arrival, but it would be a huge hurdle. And what the legislature, I would expect, would want is some type of way that you would resolve that kind of tied board action. Because think about it, if you have a 6-member board, you still have to have 4 people to pass anything, because it has to be a majority. 3-3 is a tie. And so having that 7th member always ensures that you have a 3-4 vote or a 4-3 vote, no matter what the issue is. And what I would expect the legislature would want is, if someone was proposing an even number board, was some workable solution to break a tiebreaker that didn't invest the power outside of the board. If you had a coin toss, for example, as a way of deciding a tie, I don't think that would fly with the legislature because random chance is not a favored policymaking avenue. Or if it went to, say, somebody like, the first person you saw on the street after the vote was taken, that wouldn't be acceptable either, because that person isn't empowered by the voters to make said decision either. It's really about a in that respect, there's a doctrine that's called the non-delegation doctrine. And you can't delegate certain core fundamental decisions to other entities. The select board has to make, or whatever governing body we call this, has to make those fundamental decisions. And an odd numbered board is just a way of doing that. And there's different ways in which towns and villages and municipal corporations have dealt with to make that odd number work. And sometimes it's it's an at-large position, it's a mayor position, it's some entity, or it's just simply population. You could have, for example, I know one of the things, and I don't want to touch too much onto the politics of this, but if for example, one of the things driving this could be is based on a question of balance between the village and the town outside the village, and a fear that, well, if we give that 4th person to one of the two, they're going to control the other. It's you could say one ward, the 7th ward, has to be composed of part of the old village and part of the town. It has to be, you could put prescriptive measures on that, as long as you weren't, either diluting the vote or having a situation where you weren't having the fair distribution of the vote. But you could put parameters on that as a way of balancing it. But what I would say is that, this is kind of like cutting off your own hand to go with an even numbered. Would the legislature pass it? there's a chance if it was pitched right, but it's an argument you don't have to have. And it's certainly one that you're going to have to fight uphill to convince them.
I have a follow-up question, if that's okay with everyone. So let's say, despite common wisdom and precedent and everything else, we still make the decision to put a 3-3 board structure in our charter. It goes down and we put it on the ballot in November. And let's say it's approved, it's passed by the voters, but then it goes down to the legislature in January. And the Government Operations Committee then says, well, we're troubled by this. We don't like it. Unprecedented. What would they do in your experience at that point? Would they say, elected officials from Essex, come down here and see us. We want to change this for you. And even though the voters didn't approve a seven-person board, we're going to do that for you. Would they take that level of authority into their own hands, or would they be more likely just to say, take this back and send it back to us next January with a fix?
You know, that's trying to predict the future. The legislature has done it both ways. They have made adjustments and changes to charters where they felt like, you know, we just need to do this fix, and certainly they could. If you want to say like on a possibility, could they alter that and say, no, we're not dealing with even numbered boards. We're putting in the 7th member and we're putting it this way. Absolutely. They could just as easily, that could be something where they simply toss it and don't approve it and send it back to the town and say, this is a flaw and we think it's a fatal flaw, or it's a fundamental flaw that we just aren't comfortable with. Okay. And certainly the letter that the legislature gave indicated, I think pretty clearly, that they're not comfortable with that type of disbursement of a board, for the reasons that I would suggest it's for reasons I articulated. One thing to keep in mind with that letter you got from the legislature, it wasn't political in the sense that it wasn't, these members have this issue. It was framed very much almost like a ledge council letter, which is, we've looked at this and these are structural issues that we have issues with. And that's usually a gatekeeper function that is something where if that issue continues, you either have to have a really good reason for it, or you run that risk that they'll either fix it themselves or they'll toss it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dan.
Dan, can I ask a question? Going back to your comments about non-delegation, not that we were ever thinking that if we had an even numbered board, we would resort to a coin toss, but, you know, Robert's Rules of Order states that if there's a tie, the motion fails. And I'm pretty sure the intent behind the proposal for 3-3 was to force agreement that if a disagreement fell and there was a tie, it would force the motion to fail and require those board members to go back to the drawing board and work it out. And that is the explanation that we've heard from the residents. That's exactly what they mean. They want to force us to work together because they feel that that is a more egalitarian way to do things. What are your thoughts on that? Because Robert Rules of Order is what we follow right now.
It is, but you know, in this governing board is going to be faced with certain decisions, and it won't be everyone. I mean, you know, your own experiences would inform this just as well as anyone else's. I think most boards work on consensus. You tend to have either unanimity or, you know, majority 5-2, 6-1 type of votes. You know, where there's broader consensus. But if you have an even numbered board and there's a course of action and there's a disagreement about the course of action, one person wants to go left, one person wants to go right, or I should say 3 people want to go left, 3 people want to go right, and so you make a motion, let's go left, and it's a 3-3 vote, and it fails, and so then the right side says, well, let's do a motion to go right, and it fails on a 3-3 vote, you still have to at some point go a direction. And that just creates that kind of stalemate. And the idea of having an odd number board is that it ultimately forces those decisions. I don't think it undermines, and certainly Robert's Rules of Order provides for even numbered boards and those type of resolutions, so that if it's, if it's a 3-3 vote, or, think about if, for example, you have an underseated board. So there's 7 members, but somebody's missing, absent from the meeting, and you only have 6 members there. You can easily have that type of motion that would fail under a 3-3. You can still conduct that meeting, but the idea is that at the end of the day, if there's no way of resolving it, if you have an odd numbered board, you can ultimately come to some decision. And it's the idea that there are those decisions out there that may have that type of pull, where you have to act, where not doing anything is not really an option, but keeping it at a sort of 3-3 deadlock, you're not able to make the thing go forward. That's why I pointed out, and if you want that, I guess, and this is ultimately, Elaine, what you're talking about is if the voters prefer that, if there's a group of people that strongly feel that, yeah, there are solutions to it. And I think if you had a provision where you could create a solution that was workable, the legislature might ultimately accept it. I think you would just have to have a good reason for it, and the idea that, well, we want to encourage people to reach consensus on decisions isn't one of the ones that's been compelling with the legislature. They want, at the end of the day, there to be an ability to act.
Would a potential solution to that concern be an arrangement where the chair only votes when there's a tie? So that there's always, if there's a 7-member board, 6 members are voting at all times, and the chair only votes when they have to break a tie?
Yes, that's a lot of boards do that, and I'll just I know, for example, like Montpelier, it's interesting. We just had this discussion in Montpelier. It's a 6-member council plus a mayor, and the mayor only votes if there needs to be a tie break. But that's technically not what the charter says. It's just a tradition that's developed, I think, for those exact reasons, which is, you have the 6-member board, and if there is a deadlock, then the mayor votes as the tiebreaker. But the idea is that the mayor doesn't vote regularly to look to get the council to reach consensus.
Thank you.
So would that work on a 6-member board if you had the chair not vote?
Well,
no, because it would still be, you'd still have to have 4 votes on a 6-member board. I mean, then you'd have to have near unanimity. If you had a 6-member board.
I see.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. 4. You have to have 4 to. Yeah. Okay, I got it.
Plus, then the chair is setting the agenda. There's a lot of moving pieces to that may not be. I mean, it's going to be hard enough as it is to try to bring the 2 communities together. If I can see the argument for it. I just think that there's so much gamesmanship that could come from that. I think it's almost a setup for failure. I'm interested in what you said, Dan, earlier. This is Raj. I'm interested in what you said earlier about potentially having that 7th person come from a morphed district. But I think, and I was going to ask about that earlier, but I think then that just, if it's a slightly smaller portion of the TOV and a slightly smaller portion of the village, then that by its nature leaves some other voters out, so it would just seem like a 3-3 and an at-large. And then, you know, maybe the at-large person has a little bit more, maybe they're the chair, but that's, again, that's, I'm not sure we want to go there either. Is it possible to have an at-large position have a slightly longer term? And the reason I ask that is because
Yes.
it's potentially tougher to, you know, they have the whole community to campaign in. So
We all do it now.
4-year term, a 4-year term, right? You do now, yes. I'm just trying to figure out if it's possible to. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Of course, you do it now. I'm just trying to, you know, if you're going to break the community up into 3-3, and then you're going to ask someone to do something different, can they have a 4-year term? And is that, you know what I'm saying?
Yes, that's absolutely acceptable. I mean, it would be twice as long as the governor, who has to run for the entire state. But
that'll teach you.
I only say that facetiously, but no, that's absolutely allowable and not uncommon to have someone who might have a longer term. In part because then that person also then could potentially. I mean, there's all kinds of values you can play with here. But if the question is that allowable? Absolutely.
Although just on that at-large member, you know, we have talked about that, but we have not made any determination that the at-member would have any more authority on the board, because the board is supposed to elect its own chair. And we've had concerns about a weak mayor system. So if we have one at-large member that automatically becomes chair, does that mean they're the mayor? We didn't want to go in that direction.
It kind of would. I mean, whether you know, and this gets into the difference between function and nomenclature. Often, when you have this sort of city manager system where the mayor, you also have a mayor. Traditionally, they would be the person that would chair the meeting. They also can sometimes have veto power, which you could say, no, we don't want to do that, and we don't want to call him a mayor. We just want to call him an at-large, but we want to make that at-large person the chair. You could certainly do that, but yeah, functionally, you're giving that particular seat a greater deal of power, because the chair obviously runs the meeting, has the ability to, you know, for all the reasons all of you know, that the chair has a certain amount of authority over how these meetings are run and conducted.
And I think the whole point behind the 3-3 model was to prevent one half of the town from having a majority over the other half. And so if the at-large member is elected and then is made chair, and then they are from one side of the town versus the other, it bakes in the contention that one side of the town is going to have more authority than the other. And it can also be said that the side of the town that doesn't have the chairship is being taken advantage of. I mean, I just don't want to go down that road. There's too many people out there who will say we are fixing it. Anyway, board members, further thoughts, questions? Dan, was that a hand?
Yes. Just as far as this whole discussion, debate over this issue, it's very divisive, and I find it kind of ironic. We talked about the town outside the village. If the town was to merge, we no longer should consider ourselves as separate entities. And those passionate feelings right now by people in the town outside the village and people within the village, I hope would, through it's not really attrition per se, but through time would ebb or wane and disappear. And then 50 or 100 years from now, rather than building something into a charter that harkens back to a day that we're living right now, to 100 years from now, they say, why did they ever do this? And we got to think that far in advance and say, instead of just, you know, focusing on the moment now and heated feelings, think ahead. And I think this whole 3-3 thing is going to divide this issue and really deep six any chance at a merger. And that's my personal feeling.
Oh, good point, Dan. Thank you. George?
George, you're on mute.
George, you're muted. George, you're muted.
Talking. Yeah, I know. So Dan, this is a little off subject, but ultimately connected to this. The Rutland City Charter outlines the Rutland Redevelopment Authority. Could you just quickly explain what is an authority? What's the difference between an authority, an elected board, and a commission? And I know there's a logic here, and I'll explain to everybody, but I would just like if maybe you could enlighten me a little bit there.
Yeah, so, well, a lot of times when you have these sort of either redevelopment authorities, there's, it's often either a public-private partnership or there's a certain allocation of money that they oversee and certain powers that they have to do a particular narrowly focused task. Commissions usually tend to report to the governing board or body and oversee a particular area that remains under the authority of the governing select board. So a redevelopment authority will sometimes act as a quasi-independent body to do certain types of projects.
Okay, thank you.
Andy, I got my hand up.
Oh, Andy, sorry, go ahead.
As long as we're allowing questions that are a little bit off topic, I'm concerned that this 3+3 thing is going to be a deal breaker with regard to whether whether merger passes or not. So my question is whether we can have multiple questions on the ballot. So, you know, do you approve the merger provisions? Do you approve establishing wards? Do you approve a 7-member board? Do you approve going to Australian ballot? And then if the 7-member board doesn't pass, we still get merger, but we have retain the existing 5-member board. Just trying to figure out if there's a way to get to merger without having to necessarily surmount this 3+3 question.
Well, generally, no. The idea of a charter is that you put a charter forward, and after the town has approved it. Now, as you've seen from recently, you know, there's nothing to stop a petition initiative. And I don't mean to frame it quite that way, that there are multiple ways to get charter changes to the voters and then ultimately to the legislature. But you have to be, I think you have to be careful about cutting this. It's almost like the budget, which is you may have an item in the budget that becomes a poison pill, but it doesn't give you the authority to break that budget into those components. The budget is what it is, and part of the hard work that you guys make the big bucks for is to make some of those decisions and to make something palatable. You know, knowing, of course, that if something passes one way and you want to change it, you know, a charter can ultimately be changed down the line. And so, you know, if the merger does not work or works in a way that, you know, brings, say, the opponent's fear, whether it's the opponents that promote a 3-3 or it's the people that promote the 4-3 or, you know, that odd number. If things don't work in a particular way, you know, you can always either through the new select board or by petition propose an alternate structure. You know, so if, for example, You know, say you went with the odd number, and the fears of the opponents were borne out in an election cycle or cycles, they could petition to change it, and then it would be before the voters, and vice versa. But I would suggest that you're probably, you know, the other part of this is that, you know, once this is done, I think there may be a burnout, and this is not a legal opinion, it's just simply experiential, is that I think a lot of times people put in a lot of work and a lot of thought to this and a lot of energy and a lot of emotion, and then it passes. And I think in the same way that Dan made the point earlier, is that people start to live with the new reality, and the energy to change it goes out the window unless there are those issues or questions that remain.
Doesn't completely answer my question, because we already have an existing charter, and I'm just, you know,
right,
making changes to it. And in looking at the sections, a large percentage of it is just cut and pasted from our current charter in a different order. So it's not a completely new charter. It's reordered, rearranged with a couple of instances of new language. And so I was trying to figure out if, you know, if I know there's statute that says if you're making changes to individual sections, you need to make them separate questions. If you're doing a huge change, then you need, you know, you can put forward the whole document at once. So I'm
right,
trying to get clarity on whether you can do the individual questions, you know, so that we don't lose going to Australian ballot, because the whole, you know, if the whole ball of wax doesn't pass, we lose the pieces that people really want.
right. And I'd have to look, and I guess part of my answer would be I don't know, never heard of a charter being broken up into sort of alternate components, you know, because in one respect, I think what I'm understanding, Andy, is you're saying if we have the charter, most of the charter as one provision on the ballot, you know, do we want to merge or not? And then have as two separate items, you know, do we do a 3-3 board? Here's the 3-3 board provision. Here's the 4-3 board provision, and then see what passes.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't suggest that we offer alternatives. It's a yes or no to the 7 board. And then, which case, if 7 doesn't pass, we still have the 3+3 out there. That was, you know, approved by the voters, or we could just stay with 5, right? I wouldn't offer alternatives. It would be yes or no to specific questions.
Right, but whatever goes to the legislature has to pass the voters. So if you had, I'm just trying to think this through, is you know, you're going to have the merger provisions, which I think for statute allows, and frankly for voting sake, you would want it to be voted as one item. Should we vote for this new charter or not? And then within that, there has to be some either has to be a governing provision in that, or it has to be broken out. So if part of what you're saying is, okay, let's go forward with a merger that has one governance model in it, and maybe have a second alternate governance model, because if you put a merger forward that has no governance model whatsoever, or numbers, I mean, in that respect, and then simply put a question to the voters to say, do we want to have a 4-3 or do we want to have a 3-3? And depending on the outcome of that, the problem is if it doesn't pass, you don't have that language approved by the voters to then go to the legislature. And you might have an incomplete charter. I think it's just a matter of logistics is all if I understand correctly, what you're proposing.
I'll try to put it better in writing.
George, I saw your hand up. Or
No,
did you
you're done. No,
You're
I'm done.
Okay. So at this point, boards, we had an option to, we had asked that the public wait and be patient while we have them listen to our conversation and be willing to have a midpoint where we break and take public input. I'd like to know from the boards if you feel this is a good time to do that. George?
I think it's okay, but I just want to stipulate that any questions that people want to direct towards Dan should go through the chairs first. As that's been our usual process in the past, and I'd like to emphasize that needs to continue. Thanks.
Yes, I agree. If that is the consensus of the boards, Dawn, did you raise your hand?
No, I'm trying to give you a thumbs up. That works.
Okay. Andy?
I was just going to suggest that we let Dan go so that we don't have to deal with that kind of question immediately. The other was, are we gonna intend for comments to be only on the parts we've discussed this evening, or is it open for the entire charter for public comment?
So based on what I'm seeing in the chat, because even though it's supposed to be reserved for requesting to speak, there's some commentary in there that would be someone's out there that wants to ask a question of Dan, which would have to come through the chairs. So there's that, and I would say that we would want to limit it to what we've been talking about tonight.
Okay.
Okay.
Sounds good.
All right. So we will, okay, I see Al Bombardier raising his hand, and I saw Irene request in the chat, and Ken has just requested. So Irene asked first, so we're going to do Irene, Al, Ken. Please keep your comments to the chairs and to be brief.
Thank you so much. I just want to be clear that my understanding is that the House Government Operations Committee did not have a conversation about even and odd numbered boards. There were two extremely brief comments, as in not even whole sentences, from only 2 people out of the 11 on the House Government Operations Committee on May 7th. It should also be known by people, despite what you've heard in meetings, the House Government Operations Committee did not vote on the Essex Charter change, nor did the committee vote to send the letter that was received by Town Hall on May 29th. The letter was only sent by the chair and the vice chair of the House Government Operations Committee for political reasons. I heard our attorneys say earlier it was not done for political reasons, and I beg to differ. We do also, we do also have an even-numbered board. The Essex Westbrook School Board has an even-numbered board. So if that's news to anyone, please know that. It has been going for now 3 years. They have had only 1 tie vote, to my knowledge, and they worked it out. Evan Teach has compared merger to a marriage. So I would ask anyone here who lives in a marriage or even a domestic partnership, what do you do when you tie 1-1? Do you bring your mother-in-law? Do you bring your child? Do you bring your neighbor? Who breaks that tie? It doesn't happen. The 2 people work it out, and that is what I envision for a 3+3 board. People work it out. And I would finally add that it is completely unacceptable for any board member right now, as you're putting together a merger charter, to ignore the will of the people expressed on March 3rd. All we need to do is have a chance to explain to the Government Operations Committee why it was set up this way, and I think they will, being reasonable people, come to the same conclusion we did. Thanks so much.
Well, I don't think I really heard a question in there, but Dan, I would like to ask you if you could just illuminate how the House Government Operations Committee works, and if there's anything extra that you'd like to add about the meaning or intent behind the letter we received.
Dan, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry. Well, you know, the way the House Government Operations Committee works is, you know, they review charter changes, and they will often take testimony and deliberate as a committee The reason why I tend to think that these issues were, in the letter, first of all, their phrasing was not one that said they're usually fairly clear when it's a political issue or an issue of the members. They'll articulate it that way. But what happens is whenever a charter change comes forward, Ledge Council reviews it, and they review it for issues that either are constitutional or statutory or consistency. Things that the board has, the committee has said, well, we want, a certain level of consistencies. And so, that's sort of a preliminary review. And the way I read the letter read very similar to other letters or other objections that I've seen from government ops committees, where, it's not really, we have an issue with this particular thing that's been proposed, but it's a structural issue. So at the end of the day, this is a legislative body, it's a political body, it's a committee of that body, and how they proceed, is really up to them, and they do have the ability to do it and to persuade them. But I didn't read this as this is something that we have some issue with as membership. This is more a structural issue. And so, ultimately, if, the other thing is that the government ops committees, they don't tend to have vigorous debates when provisions are not satisfactory to them. They just don't pass. They tend to push it off. They've got a huge, almost every session they have a very busy agenda. And I've seen charter provisions where they have issues with it that they just simply put aside. For example, a number of years ago, Montpelier, when they had the Supreme Court decision that said that they couldn't provide ordinances over Berlin Pond, well, somebody tried to change the charter of Montpelier to have jurisdiction over Berlin Pond, which would have been an interesting thing in that you would have had one municipality controlling land of another municipality through ordinances. And it just was something that the legislature, the government ops committee, was not even going to begin to handle. And so because it went against so many fundamental principles, that it just died. It wasn't as if they had a vigorous debate. It wasn't as if they had members talking about this. It just never, that actually did come up for a vote at the end of the session, but it wasn't something that was the product of, the sort of very clear read that you might get from, say, a board like this one, where people would give weather reports of that nature.
Thank you, Dan. Al Bombardier?
Oh, well, thank you, Elaine. Appreciate the opportunity to just say a few words. Been on the EWSD school board for about a lot of boards for about 25 years. So I've seen a lot of boards and a lot of thrashing. So I just want to make 3 points. First point, I agree with Dan. There needs to be one question to the voters, and don't stray from that. If you go in with multiple choices, it's going to be all over the place. And second point, Dan made a good point about, if it's a 3-3 board, 3 want to go left, 3 want to go right. But when we had a major split on transportation provision for Essex Junction with a $700,000 bill, there was a split, and the question had to be asked, where are we going and why? That was the most important question. And it took about 6 or 7 weeks before we finally had direction and knew that and then we had consensus, and that got approved. So it really forced the discussion. It was a quality discussion, and we figured out how to ration transportation for the whole district, all of Essex if we had to. And that was the second part of it that was a real challenge. But it all worked out because we did the right thing for the whole community. And that was good. The third point I would mention is I'm a little concerned about a number of things I've heard. We don't have a real governance committee here. This is between the village and the select board. So even though I'm in the town outside of the village, it is hard to understand why I don't have equal representation, or at least better representation on the existing boards. But that set aside, there are cost implications and cost shifts built into this the new charter for, whether it's capital or a tax shift or water and sewer and more tax shifts. I think if people outside of the village understood or had an opportunity to understand how this proposal affects them in a very economic and a political and representation way, I think you get a lot of feedback. And that's what's missing. We don't have public input or the opportunity to discuss with our public what this means to them. I also spent some time on the Red Committee for the school. That Red Committee was made up of independent people at random across our community interests. And it wasn't anyone on existing boards. And I think that was a big plus because everyone got to be heard and better understood. It was a great process. So I just wanted to share those 3 points with you. I can see the 3-3 plus 1, but I can also see 3-3. I think Dan made a good point. There needs to be a tiebreaker here, and it may be the solution, but there are multiple alternatives, and we have time to talk about it. So, thank you for your time, Elaine. And
Thank you, Al.
for the whole group as well.
Thank you. Ken, do you still have your hand up?
I do.
Okay.
I'll try to fill in. Thanks again for having me speak. I'll try to fill in for Andy. Andy, I hope I articulate what you're trying to say correctly. I think what Andy was trying to say was if there was a complete merger plan on the ballot in November and a question to change the existing charter to Australian ballot, let's say for annual meeting, and the merger fails, the Australian ballot succeeds, that would go forward. If the merger was to succeed, that would override because the other question would be changing the existing charter, which would no longer exist. The new charter would take precedent, obviously, if the charter was to be passed. I think that's what Andy was trying to say. Andy, can you shake your head maybe? No? Yes?
Well, that was part of it. That was part of it.
And the other thing I would say, thank you, Andy, was I've seen some of the correspondence that took place in the Governance Operations Committee. The letter that was sent out was at the request of the chairperson to the vice chair because of the deluge of emails that she was receiving from town residents. So it was more of a response to, it's a hassle right now with the COVID thing. They're dealing with very difficult problems. They really didn't need all that grief. And I think it was more of a knee-jerk reaction, honestly. So I'm basically going to push back on the concept that it was a non-political response. I think it was maybe stress-related response, but semi-political at the very least. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Well, we had planned to hoped to stop at 10. It's 9:45. We have gotten as far as section 7. Wait, let's see. 702. My suggestion is we convene again another day. That's just my suggestion. Okay, 2 thumbs up from Andrew. Select Board, what are your thoughts? And Evan and Greg.
I will bow to the will of the rest of the select board. I could keep going for hours.
I'm willing to keep going too.
Okay. John?
This just isn't going to solve itself.
Whatever you decide to do, can I ask Dan a question now?
Of course.
He leaves us. How do you, so the town voted unanimously to go to 3-3. How do you honor the town's wishes? They're the same people that elected us. They
That was
voted
not
for
a unanimous vote. That was not a unanimous vote. Just need to clarify.
Well, it passed.
It passed, but it was by far not unanimous.
The village voters.
So it
actually did not
passed, but
support
how
that.
do you still honor the vote?
That's, oh, if I may, that's the hard part of governing, because as you've heard tonight, there are different ways to spin or explain, what we believe boards meant or voters meant when they either vote or send letters. And so, you have these competing expectations. Part of it is, if you believe that the voters of both the village and the town outside of the village really want a 3-3 governing body, this is something that they feel very strongly about as a driving matter, then obviously that's an issue. As I indicated, I really, this is my sense is that, if you have if you have provisions that deal with going forward, that left-right split that will satisfy the government ops committee, then that may be one solution. The other way to look at it is to say, well, why do people want a 3-3 split? I mean, there's not, I don't think anyone here is saying we want a 3-3 split because we believe even numbers are the best in the world and we hate odd numbers. It's really something deeper about how do we divide, how do we merge, but not have one group overpower the interests of the other? And how do we make sure that consensus is the driving vehicle of the day? And I guess what I would say is that, if you had a governing body in which every major decision was a 3-4 split, that's a recipe for discord. Only the U.S. Supreme Court can really get away with those type of splits over and over again. A governing body that has to lead a town has to drive on consensus a lot of the time. And I think a well-functioning town really thrives on that kind of consensus. I mean, you see it all over the state. There is a power in consensus, whether you have an odd number or an even number. And if you're always making choices that benefit one side rather than another, such that they feel they're getting, then you're going to have an unmerger proposal before you, because there'll be a significant population that will feel disenfranchised by that process. I think, there are different ways to resolve it, which we've talked about, such as, having a 3-3 split, but having some inherent way within that. And I haven't been tasked or asked to say what those could be. So I haven't researched that answer to any degree, but it's not something that would be obvious. It's not something that could be like a coin toss or grabbing a person off the street or delegating to the town manager, for example, to be the tiebreaker. Not only would the town manager never not want that power, it would be a recipe for disaster, as well as a question of, well, can an unelected person make these decisions? So, you know, there's not a really easy solution to that kind of split. And so you're left with saying, well, will the voters accept something where we do a 3-4, or, you know, I'm using the 7 model. I'm not suggesting you're going to go with 7 or 5 or 9, but, you know, you had that odd number split, and you explained how consensus was important, and this was not going to change that process. And would the voters agree with it? That's a political question. I don't know what the answer is, or if you had some protection measure, such as an at-large person, or as I suggested, you know, some district that required there to be, you know, composed of even number of people of these different types of groups, so that this person represented the sort of tiebreaker. And, you know, you could have somebody be that tiebreaker person that only votes, is an elected member of the board, participates as the board, but only votes if there is a tie. And have that person, and not necessarily make that person the chair, but just have that person be part of the tie-breaking vote. I mean, you can get creative in that respect, as long as the power is within the board, it's clear, and it's, you know, this is an elected person, so that if at the end of the day the voters don't like what's being done, they have the ability to vote this person out, or these decision makers out.
Thank you.
You know, I think it's worth noting that the outcome of that vote in some possible way. There was a plurality of voters that voted in favor of this change. We've been given a pretty strong message that an even-numbered board is not the way to go. And so honoring the intention of the voters by having a 3-3-1 board with a tiebreaker person who doesn't vote unless there's a tie might be the way forward on that. And I also want to remind the board some research that was done before the 3-3 vote. In the last 6 years, or excuse me, 2015 to 19, the select board voted unanimously 94.9% of the time. There were only 40 instances when anyone dissented. So just a reminder that these ties that we're worried about up till now, historically, have been extremely rare. And they were never along village versus town outside the village lines. So let's just keep that in mind, that the reality is that we all get along really, really well. And all of our representatives on both boards do everything they possibly can to represent the entire community that elected them. And we have the statistics to show that we actually do vote at the town's best interests almost every time. We disagree sometimes, but 94.9% of the time we don't. So let's have some perspective. Just want to get that out. Select board, trustees, what is your pleasure? Oh, and Patrick, sorry, your hand was up. You're muted.
All right. Apologies. I didn't want to interrupt anyone during the conversations, but I do want to bring it up because EWSD does get mentioned a lot, and I am the only person on the select board or the trustees who is also on the Essex Westford School District. It is bearing in mind they do have an even numbered of people. Ties, however, can only occur if Martha Heath and Andre Roy specifically split in their vote, and the rest of the school board then also proceeds to tie in a 4-4 vote. It's a very unique and not at all applicable to 3 people and 3 other people. A combination of 6 can divide on a lot of different ways, but a 10-member board that very explicitly can only reach a tie when 2 specific members are split in the decision making, and subsequently all 8 other members of that board then also choose to split. That's why there was only one ever tie in EWSD, is because it's extremely rare because of the mechanism of the setup. 6 people with no other mechanism like that is just, the potential for tie is just obviously much greater. And then Al's comment to the one time we did have a tie vote, he and I actually sat on the transportation committee together and did some excellent work. But Al, I think, remembers that maybe differently than I do, because that was an issue that occurred in August and then took us until December to resolve. The one time that we tied on a decision was 4+ months of work. It was the formation of a transportation committee. It was the introduction of a new policy, and it was figuring out how to divide the money and the buses and what to do with the portions of the community that weren't served by them. We did work at it, it's true, but it basically put us in a stop mode for a lot of other business for an extended period of time, which is why, you know, I'm very pleased that we worked in such a great manner on the school board. But ties were rare, to be clear, because of the setup around it and the exacting manner with which those ties had to happen.
Okay. The question then is on the table. Two things. Do we want to continue? And do we want to relieve Dan and let him return to his family?
We've well exercised Dan tonight.
Yeah.
Certainly appreciate his input. Appreciate his time.
Dan, thank you very much for being our trusted guide. We present you with a lot of conundrums, and your patience with us is much appreciated.
Thanks, Dan.
My pleasure. No
Talk
problem.
to you soon.
All right.
So Elaine, you were asking about going forward. Seeing as how we are partway through subchapter 7, what if we were to just finish that and then call it a night?
That works for me.
Yes.
Okay. I
That's a
see
lot of
Andy
thumbs.
nodding. I see Pat nodding. Dawn's nodding. You got
Yeah.
it.
I think we were talking about the attorney. And last I remember, we were talking about how the village we appoint, but the manager basically brings us a recommendation. How does the town currently do it?
If I recall, George mentioned that in the village charter, there's a selecting the attorney with the advice and consent of the trustee board, and I don't think we got a chance to reach a consensus on that language.
So yeah, in the village charter it says the trustees' approval shall be required for the manager's annual appointments of, and then it lists various positions. I would be of the mindset personally of just keeping it the way that the trustees have done it. That way, if there's anything glaring, then we can say so. But in the 8 years I've been on the board, we haven't yet had any glaring concerns.
Yeah.
I'm good with that.
Me too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A whole lot of yeses.
Yes, I agree with that.
Okay. So that part 4. Andy, you had a question about whether it was too restrictive or not.
So that was in 7024 says that the manager shall attend all meetings. I think there's some other suggested language from Dan, right?
About yes,
entitled to attend, or as designee,
Yes.
Good, trustees. I heard a yes from George. Dan?
Yes.
Amber?
Yep.
Raj?
Yes, sir.
So does that suggest that the select board can't meet without the manager or a designee? Because we have, very rarely, but we have.
I would say that it does read that the manager is entitled and should have the right to be at a meeting. That's how I would interpret that. At the same time, I was going to say at the same time, I know in the trustees we have provisions where we can meet without him, especially with regards to evaluation.
Which would
George,
be
your
an
hand?
executive session anyway.
Right.
Yeah. Can I
Go ahead, George.
I think this might be, I hate to put it this way, but this might be a question for Dan. Evan might know, but I think in a council manager form of government, I think there are statutes that might pertain to this that say that a manager, the manager or his or her designee shall have an opportunity to be present. In other words, I don't know. I think this might require a little inquiry that a board can meet exclusively without the manager. Evan, do you know anything about that?
I do not specifically know Vermont law yet to that point. Again, council manager form of government, it would be odd for the board to specifically exclude the manager from being at the meeting. There are topics that may come up that you may want to be in executive session about the manager where you don't want him or her there, but not the actual meeting.
Yeah.
Now, the manager, like any other human, might be on vacation, might be sick, might have another engagement that night and would send a representative. I wouldn't want to say that the manager has to be at every meeting. That's going to be near impossible.
Great. Amber, you have your hand up.
I was just going to note that the current charter says that, now I gotta find it. The manager shall attend all trustees meetings and shall have the right to take part in discussion and make recommendations, but may not vote. So shall attend all is basically what the current charter says, and doesn't actually allow even for a designee, which is odd.
Yeah, that's odd.
And to my point is, I'm guessing it's just how it, yeah. Well, I'm not going to argue with an attorney.
I welcome you to.
No, it's too late. I would just say, I think the word shall, it's just it's probably applied differently versus, you must or whatever. But I think that we could let Dan wordsmith it.
Is everybody good with allowing Dan to do the wordsmithing?
Yes.
Yep.
Great. That brings us into the hiring and removal process, where Andy, you had a question about is it better off in the contract, and it looks like Dan is saying that it should be in the charter, and cites a case in St. Johnsbury. I assume we're good then keeping that in.
Yep.
Then vacancy in the office. I'm trying to read Dan's question or answer back. So in reading Dan's response, I don't see the need to take it out. How others feel.
Well, I think it might be a little prescriptive the way we have it to put titles in there like assistant town manager, but instead say manager's designee, as is suggested by Evan's note.
Yeah.
Yep. So how does that sound to everybody?
Since this is referring to a vacancy in the office of manager, who would be a manager's designee if we use that language?
Well, that would be whoever it is the manager designates. So
Do we want to
I
limit
think when you
who he can designate though?
No, I wouldn't.
no, I mean when you use the phrase designee, then you're implicitly giving direction to the manager to make that choice for us.
Yeah. Okay, I guess maybe I'm misreading or misunderstanding it. Rather than when I saw vacancy in office of manager, I was like, Evan, forgive me. Say Evan were to suddenly drop dead.
Hey.
And
Couldn't
I
I
asked
just
for
break
forgiveness
my arm?
first. Okay, you break your arm and you're rendered speechless.
He's
You know,
fallen into the culvert and dead
the manager's designee in that case would need to be the person that he appointed in charge. But if he was unable to make that decision, I guess that's what I'm asking about. The designee would have to be
Secretary of
someone
State.
the manager. Yeah, it's just right. I mean, again, it may be too ticky-tacky for the charter language, but it's just
Greg,
since it's literally talking about what happens to him if he is incapacitated for some reason. I don't know that an incapacitated manager can actually make a designee.
Greg had just highlighted it on the screen for us.
Well, but then that would be the select board's decision. If something happened to the manager that he was incapacitated, then the select board could appoint an interim. Like there.
Yeah, you're right, Greg. Yeah, highlighting that. Okay, I guess it is later than I thought. It's covered.
Okay, so from the sounds of it, it sounds like our concerns are in there. With regards to that, and the question of it, is it too specific about the assistant town manager? I don't know.
We currently have a deputy.
Yep.
Town manager.
And I was going to suggest, again, we're not wordsmithing, but when we were going to talk with Dan, we would probably throw a slash after assistant and put deputy, whatever the title is of whether it's assistant or deputy town manager, whatever their current title is. Again, assuming this is a short-term vacancy and not the other definition of vacancy, whereas the manager has either left, retired, or been fired.
Evan, does a town have a continuity of operations plan?
We do.
So
I believe, yeah. And usually when I am not in the office, it goes to the deputy town manager.
And I assume that that's approved by the select board?
The continuity plan?
Yes.
It would be, as is the emergency operations plan.
So then in that
That's
instance,
probably the one I'm thinking of.
So then in that instance, is this duplicative of that?
No.
And just go by a plan that would be updated more frequently than a charter?
Sure.
Would people be okay taking that, however, if the manager section out, and then knowing that we have an emergency operations plan?
That's an interesting way to look at it.
It's 10 at night, come on.
I just want to make sure we don't lose the ability to appoint somebody in case there's no...
I'm not talking about... Yeah, I'm not talking about losing that. I'm only saying what Greg has highlighted.
Just got to make sure that the policy that we have in place covers that.
Yep.
You know, for simple things, the chief of police designates someone if he is on vacation to have his authority. He does that on his own. It's usually chain of command. I have done it many times. If I'm going to be on vacation, not available by phone or otherwise, I will tell the organization who's making decisions this week.
Yeah. Amber, I think
So
I see your
I
hand
can
up.
do that more formally.
Great. So did that sound good to everybody?
Yep.
Seeing some head nods.
Sure.
That's the end of subchapter 7.
All right.
Absolutely, that was the plan.
Okay.
And if it pleases the boards, I'd like to schedule.
Leaving off at subchapter 8, and then there does not look to be a ton of comments on the remainder of the document. So hopefully we can accomplish the final review of those sections and then move into the more substantive questions that evening. At least one of them.
Dan, you have your hand up.
Yes. I believe at the beginning of the meeting, there were comments on things not on the agenda. Somebody brought up something about the last meeting and the conversation with the police department and being able to speak out about that. And I think you or Elaine said something about maybe we'd speak to that this evening. So we just wanted to push that off to the next joint meeting next week.
Dan, I had said that it was going to be on the July 6th agenda.
Oh, okay.
So
okay. I just
we will have time to talk about that as well.
No, I know that a lot of people want to.
Yeah, you'll see some materials in the packet that will hopefully lay out logical next step.
Will we have enough time to have people make comments that evening and do this work?
So the goal for the 6th, Raj, is Andrew and I have drafted a memo to Evan to ask him to tap the CJC to assemble stakeholders and begin a conversation. So we both agreed, Andrew and I felt that the CJC was the logical place to start that conversation because that's their expertise and it's what's in their mission. And we just simply were going to ask them to do that, and that way they're not confined by our timing and our schedule, and they can pick it up and go for it right away. So and they are the experts who would be able to provide an appropriate forum for our community to start speaking. Is that any questions or comments on that?
No, that's
it's
fine,
sort of a heads up of what's to come next week.
So on that portion, I assume we can move off of the business item and go into the one consent item that we have for tonight, which is for us trustees. And so if a trustee would like to make a motion.
Hang on. I don't have the motion in front of me here. Andrew.
It would be to adopt the enclosed version of the Village of Essex Junction General Rules and Personnel Regulations.
So moved.
Second.
Thank you, George. Thank you, Amber. All those, or is there any further discussion on the motion? Hearing none, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
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 Anybody opposed?
Aye.
Okay, so that passed unanimously. And that brings us into reading file, which is just board member comments. Does any board member want to say anything else tonight, or are we all done?
I'm having strawberry shortcake right after this.
That's great.
Are you going to share with the class?
Sure, come on over.
I will sadly be told it's too late for dessert. So there's that. I guess that moves the dessert to breakfast.
All right, well, if there's no other comments, then if someone wants to make a motion to adjourn.
So
I'll move to adjourn.
Wow, that was fast. Sounded like Dan made the motion, and I think Raj seconded that one. Any further discussion from the trustees? Hearing none, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Anybody opposed? Thank you all. Good night.
Thanks, everybody.
Night.
Good night.
Good night, trustees. Thank you. Is there a motion to adjourn from the
Motion to adjourn.
Is there a second?
Second.
Did I hear a second? All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Aye. Opposed? Okay, thank you all for your hard work. We'll do it again next week.
Have a good night, everybody.
Have a safe
night.
4th.
Thank you. You too. Thank you, Evan. Thank you, Greg.